Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was a cold, early morning when my dad and I set out for our ice fishing trip. I was around 10 years old, just old enough to feel like I could handle it on my own, but still young enough to be excited about the idea of a day spent on the ice. The air was biting, crisp and sharp, cutting through the layers of my winter clothes as we loaded up our gear. Snow had fallen the night before, covering everything in a fresh, thick blanket of white. The world outside looked like a picture postcard, everything pure and untouched. We parked near the edge of the lake, the truck's engine still rattling as we got out. The ground was solid with the weight of the snow, but I knew beneath that it was the lake. I'd been ice fishing with my dad before, so I was familiar with the way the ice could be deceptive. What looked solid from a distance didn't always mean it was safe, but it didn't bother me at the time. I trusted my dad to make sure we were safe. After grabbing the sled full of gear and the auger, we started walking out to the ice house. The snow was thick, and with each step, we sunk a little deeper into it. The walking was slow, and the weight of the snow, combined with the constant biting cold, made everything feel heavier, like we were moving through molasses. My boots crunched against the snow, and with every step, I could feel the dampness creeping up, my socks getting wet and uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything. This was an adventure, after all. I was here with my dad. We were probably about halfway to the ice house when I noticed something strange. The surface of the ice wasn't visible, not entirely. The snow from the night before had fallen thickly, and it covered everything, the ice, the cracks, the holes. It looked like a completely solid, uniform surface, as if the whole lake was just one big, snow-covered field. I didn't give it much thought at first. My mind was more focused on what we were going to do once we set up, how we were going to drill the holes and fish, maybe even catch a big one today. But as we kept walking, the atmosphere began to feel a little off. It felt like the world around me had quieted down, the snow absorbing every sound, making everything feel isolated. Then, in the blink of an eye, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. 1 second I was walking along. The next, I felt the earth open up beneath me, and I was falling through the ice. There was no warning, no sound, no cracking of the ice to signal what was happening. I just fell. The drop wasn't far, maybe a few feet, but it felt like an eternity. The icy water hit me instantly, shockingly cold, and before I could even think about what was happening, I felt the full weight of the freezing lake pull me down. The ice that had once felt so solid beneath me was gone, and I was submerged in the frigid water. I don't remember much of the fall itself. It was like everything happened too fast. But what I do remember is how my body instantly reacted to the cold. It was like my entire system shut down. I couldn't move. My muscles locked up. The cold was so intense that it felt like it was draining the life out of me. And for a moment, I didn't even know if I was still alive. I couldn't feel anything, except for the numbness that began to spread across my limbs, starting in my feet and hands, and then creeping up into my chest. I could hear the thudding of my heart, but it felt slow, sluggish. I didn't even think to scream. My breath was caught in my chest, and I couldn't get air in, let alone make any noise. My eyes were wide open, but the cold made everything seem distant, muted, like I was in a dream. I looked up, and I could see the hole I had fallen through, the dark water swirling beneath me. But the worst part, the part that I can still feel when I close my eyes, was that I couldn't swim. I could see the surface above me, but no matter how hard I tried to move my body, I couldn't get back to it. It was as though I had forgotten how to use my arms and legs. The cold was everywhere now. My body, which had once been full of life and energy, felt heavy and weighed down. Each second that passed felt like an hour. I remember the panic starting to settle in, slowly at first, like a creeping vine that started small and then wrapped itself around my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't get out. I can still feel the numbness in my fingers and toes when I think about it. It was like my body was becoming someone else's, someone cold and distant. I couldn't even feel my hands gripping the water, couldn't even feel my legs kicking. It was like I wasn't even in my own body anymore. And then, I don't know how, but something inside of me snapped. Maybe it was the thought of my dad, maybe it was just the sheer will to survive, but suddenly I was fighting. I could feel my body working again, like I had willed my limbs into action. My arms shot up and out of the water, and I grabbed at the edge of the ice. The snow on the surface was still there, covering everything, but I could feel the thin, cold surface beneath my fingers. I didn't know if it would hold, but I didn't have any choice. I needed to get out. With every ounce of energy I had left, I pulled myself up, scraping and clawing at the thin edge of the ice. The cold was unbearable, but I kept pulling. I could hear my dad shouting from somewhere above me, but I couldn't respond. I couldn't make any sound. I could only concentrate on getting myself to the surface, and somehow, with all my strength, I managed to pull my upper body out of the freezing water. My arms were shaking with effort, and my body was trembling uncontrollably from the cold. Then I felt my dad's hands on my arms. His grip was strong, and he yanked me the rest of the way out of the hole, dragging me across the ice and snow. My body felt like it was on fire and frozen at the same time. I couldn't feel my legs, couldn't feel anything except the shaking, the violent tremors that wouldn't stop. But my dad didn't stop. He pulled me the whole way back to the ice house, the sound of his boots crunching through the snow mixing with my own gasping breaths. When we finally made it to the ice house, he laid me down, and I remember the warmth of the heater and the blankets wrapping around me. It felt like the warmth of the world again, like I had been on the edge of something, and then pulled back from it. My dad didn't say anything, and neither did I. There was no need for words. I was alive. I had made it. The rest of the day is a blur. I remember feeling numb, not just from the cold, but from the shock of what had happened. My dad kept an eye on me, making sure I was okay. I don't remember if we fished that day. I don't think we did. We packed up and left early, and I didn't say much. I don't even think I told him how scared I had been, how for a few moments, I honestly didn't know if I was going to make it. I don't think I had the words for it then. When we got back to the truck, my hands were still shaking, but I was warm, and I was safe. That's what mattered. But the lake, the cold, and the hole stayed with me long after we drove away. It stayed with me for years. That was the last time I went ice fishing with my dad. I couldn't shake the memory of that cold water, the way it had felt like it was trying to swallow me whole. I couldn't forget how I had nearly died, how it was only my will to survive, and my dad's quick thinking that pulled me out. Even now, when I think back to that day, I can still feel the cold in my bones. It's a feeling I never want to experience again, but I've learned something from that day. Something deep and quiet, something that never fully goes away. Life, it turns out, can be fragile. One moment you're walking on solid ground, and the next, you're falling through the ice. You never know what might happen. And sometimes, all you have to rely on is yourself, and the people who are there to pull you back from the edge. It was a typical night. I had just gotten off the phone with a friend, and was in the living room, watching whatever random show was on TV. The house was quiet, too quiet, like it always is when you're alone in the evening. The house is one of those old ones with creaky floors and a soft, settled feel to it. The kind of house where, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the air conditioning humming softly in the background. I was sitting on the couch, my feet tucked underneath me, half paying attention to the show. It was one of those moments where you can feel your body more than you feel your mind, like you're just waiting for something to grab your attention. I had the lamp next to the couch on, and the dim glow gave the room that safe, cozy feel. It was the middle of the week, so I didn't expect anyone to be out at this time. It was a little past 9 p.m., nothing unusual. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't the usual friendly ding-dong you hear when it's a delivery person or a neighbor. This one was harsh, sudden, and out of place in the stillness of the night. For a second, I froze, staring at the TV as if expecting the ringing to fade. But no, it didn't stop. It rang again, a sharp ding-dong that felt like it vibrated through the house. I didn't move right away. Every time I was home alone, especially at night, I got this gut instinct to be cautious. I didn't want to just open the door and find some random stranger on the other side. I wasn't expecting anyone, no friends, no deliveries, no family. I just stared at the door for a moment, trying to figure out who would be here at this time. I stood up slowly, my feet heavy on the carpet. I moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I knew I wasn't going to open it, but I still felt compelled to check who was there. There's a peephole in the door, and I figured I'd just take a quick look without flipping on the porch light. Didn't want to give away that I was home, just in case it was someone I didn't want to talk to. I slid my face up to the peephole. It was dark outside, almost pitch black, but the streetlight across the street threw a dim glow over the front yard. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I focused, I could make out a small, shadowy figure standing on the porch. It wasn't really a person, it was more of a black blob. It was definitely small, though, maybe around 3 or 4 feet tall, and there wasn't any clear shape to it. It was like looking at a silhouette with no sharp edges. It was hard to tell exactly what I was seeing, and I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. The figure wasn't just standing there, it was moving. It wasn't walking like you'd expect. It was doing this strange, almost fluid motion, dipping down low to the ground and then swinging its arms outward. At first, I thought it was just someone playing around, maybe a child or a prankster, but it didn't make any sense. The movement was too odd. The arms were swaying, kind of like a person pretending to be a bird or maybe even a dancer. It didn't make any noise. I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing, loud in my ears. It just moved. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Why was this little figure out there in the dark, swaying like that? Who would be out there in the dead of night, doing something so strange? I probably looked for a solid 10 seconds, though it felt like forever. I could barely breathe. My eyes were glued to the peephole, watching as the figure moved this way and that. It was as if it was waiting for something. Maybe waiting for me to open the door, maybe just enjoying whatever it was doing. But I had to look away. I couldn't keep watching it. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. The movements weren't human, but they weren't animal either. It was just wrong. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to think. My mind raced through every possible explanation, and none of them made sense. I tried to shake the image from my head, but the motion was still burned into my mind. I waited a moment, trying to get my bearings. I needed to check again. With my heart still racing, I hesitated before returning to the peephole. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't look again, I might never know what I had seen, and that was somehow worse than knowing. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe it was a neighbor or a prankster. Maybe there was a rational explanation, and I just needed to see it again. So I crept back to the door, my fingers trembling on the handle. Slowly, I pressed my eye back to the peephole. The figure was still there, but it wasn't moving. It had completely stopped. I couldn't see it clearly now. It was just this black shape against the darkness. It was almost as though it had become part of the night, blending into the shadows around it. And then just like that, it was gone. I don't know if it moved away or if it was never really there, but when I looked again, it was simply gone. The porch was empty. There wasn't even a sign of it. No footsteps in the dirt, no marks in the grass. It was as if whatever it was just vanished. It had been standing there one moment, and in the next, it was nothing but the quiet, dark night. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the empty porch. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to call someone, or whether it was even worth mentioning. Was I imagining things? Had I just been too tired, too stressed, to really process what I saw? I slowly backed away from the door, my mind still racing. I didn't feel safe anymore. My heart wouldn't stop pounding, and even though I was inside, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The sense of unease clung to me, even as I turned off the TV and tried to distract myself. It didn't help. I could still feel my body tense every time I thought about it. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, had me jumping. I kept imagining that figure, that strange little shape moving out there, watching me. I didn't tell anyone about it. How could I? What was there to explain? I couldn't even explain it to myself. It wasn't like I could say, "Hey, there was this little thing dancing outside my door at night," and expect anyone to understand. So I kept it to myself, hoping that I was just tired or that it was some weird trick of the light. But I know what I saw, and every time I think about it, I get that same feeling, that knot in my stomach, that creeping unease. What was it? What was that thing? And why was it out there, doing whatever it was doing, right outside my door? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to know. To this day, I'm more cautious when I hear the doorbell ring, especially at night. I check through the peephole, but I'm always prepared for something I can't quite explain, something I can't forget. I woke up that morning with no reason to believe my world was about to change forever. The sun was already coming through my window, warm light spreading across my blankets. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, drifting in from the kitchen. It was just another day. A regular, nothing special kind of morning. I was still half asleep, my mind slow, my body heavy from the night's rest. I stretched and blinked at the ceiling, my thoughts still fuzzy. Then I noticed something. The house was quiet. Too quiet. There was no sound of my dad moving around. No clinking of a coffee mug being set down. No rustling of a newspaper. The silence sat heavy, pressing into my chest with something I couldn't quite name yet. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up. The carpet was cold under my feet. I yawned and rubbed my eyes, then stepped out into the hallway. The smell of coffee was stronger now, but it wasn't fresh. It had been sitting for a while, going stale in the pot. I walked toward the living room, the same path I had taken 1,000 times before. I wasn't thinking about anything. I wasn't worried yet. I wasn't scared. Not yet. Then I saw him, my dad, lying on the floor. His skin pale, his eyes half open but seeing nothing. A stillness to him that wasn't sleep, wasn't rest, wasn't anything but the end of something that had always been there. For a few seconds, my brain refused to understand. I stood there, frozen, my body locking up as if by rejecting the moment, I could undo it. My mind grasped for explanations. Maybe he had just fallen. Maybe he was unconscious. Maybe this wasn't real. I ran to him. I dropped to my knees. My hands were on him, shaking him, calling his name. He didn't move. His body was still, but not just still wrong. The wrong kind of stillness. The kind that tells you something deep in your gut, something ancient and unshakable. I started CPR. My hands pressing against his chest, trying to force air into lungs that had already given up. My breath shaky, desperate. I counted the compressions. I tried to keep my mind focused, but there was already a part of me that knew. That part of me had known from the moment I stepped into the room. He was already gone, and no matter what I did, he wasn't coming back. The next few days blurred together. I barely remember them. The funeral, the people, the condolences that all sounded the same. The weight of it all pressing down on me until I felt like I was drowning in something thick and heavy, something I couldn't claw my way out of. But it wasn't just the grief. It wasn't just the loss. It was the dreams. The first one came just a few days after. I was walking down the hallway, the same way I had that morning. I could hear the quiet, feel the stale coffee in the air. I knew what was coming. I knew what I was about to see. And in the dream, something inside me broke before I even got there. A scream ripped out of me, raw and desperate, echoing through the house. Then I woke up, heart pounding, hands shaking. The scream still caught in my throat. And it didn't stop. Night after night, the same dream. The same walk down the hall. The same moment of realization. The same scream tearing through me before I could reach the living room. Before I had to see it again. I stopped sleeping. Or at least I tried to. I'd stay awake for as long as I could, pushing myself past exhaustion. Keeping myself going with coffee and energy drinks, and anything that kept me from closing my eyes. I'd stay up for 2-3 days at a time, but eventually my body would give in, and the nightmare would be waiting for me. It got to the point where I wasn't even living anymore. I was just existing between the moments of sleep and fear. Then one day, in the middle of the afternoon, something inside me snapped. My girlfriend, now my wife, was with me. I don't remember what I was doing. I don't remember what triggered it. But suddenly, I wasn't in the present anymore. I was back in that morning, and I was trapped. Over and over, I relived it. The walk, the silence, the moment of realization. But in this nightmare, I fought it. I stopped myself before I could get to the living room. I screamed and screamed, refusing to move forward, refusing to see it again. And in the real world, I was screaming too. My girlfriend told me later that I tensed up like I was having a seizure. My body locked in place for nearly an hour. She couldn't get through to me. She could only watch as I lived the worst moment of my life on repeat. Until, finally, I let myself walk into that living room. Until, finally, I let myself see him. And then it was over. The dream stopped. Just like that. But the fear of my own mind never left. #### Iraq, 2005. Years later, I found myself in Iraq. A different world, a different life, but the same mind. The same fear that it might turn on me again. I was leading a convoy, driving through open desert, when the warning came through. Intel said the enemy was using children, sending them out in front of convoys to make us stop. And then an ambush. I remember how that sat in my chest. The weight of it. the knowledge of what that meant. And then it happened. A child ran out, 300 meters ahead, and I froze. Every instinct in me screamed to stop, to swerve, to do anything but what I had been ordered to do. But my truck chief was yelling, telling me to floor it. So I did. At the last second, the kid jumped out of the way. We kept moving, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, when we reached the FB, I tried to sleep. But sleep wasn't my friend. It never had been. The nightmare came, and this time, it was different. I was driving again. The child ran out in front of me. But this time, he didn't move. I ran him over. I felt the impact, the sickening lurch of the vehicle. I stopped. I got out. I walked around the back of the truck, my stomach twisting, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, that feeling, that horrible, soul-crushing dread. I knew what I was about to see. I knew, but I couldn't stop myself. I rounded the truck, and lying there, broken and lifeless, wasn't the child. It was my father. The same way I had found him. The same way I had lost him. That same scream tore out of me, raw and full of something I couldn't even name. And when I woke up, I was running, full sprint, through the FOB, not knowing where I was or how I had gotten there. The fear was real. The panic was real. I didn't sleep again for a long time after that. I haven't had that dream again. Not since that night in Iraq. But I live in fear of my own mind. Because I know what it's capable of. I know it can turn on me when I least expect it. And I know that somewhere deep inside, those memories are still there. Waiting. I just hope they never come back. That basement was the worst place in the world. I don't know why it scared me so much, but it did. Maybe it was the way the air felt different down there, heavy and stale, like it had been trapped for 100 years. Maybe it was the sound, or rather, the lack of sound. Even with the washing machine running, the basement had this awful stillness to it, like something was waiting. And then there were the dreams. I had them for as long as I could remember, always about the basement. Some of them I could barely remember when I woke up, but others stuck with me like scars. The worst one was the man, the thing that looked like a man, anyway. I never saw his face, only his legs, stepping through the basement doorway, slow and deliberate. I always knew he was looking for me. I always knew he knew where I was. But the worst part was that he liked it. He liked that I was afraid. I had that dream so many times that I started recognizing it while I was still in it. But knowing it was a dream didn't help. I could tell myself, this isn't real, but it didn't matter. I still felt the same fear. I still couldn't wake up. Sometimes the dreams were different. Sometimes I was in the basement, just standing at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. I knew, that if I stepped down, I'd be swallowed by the dark. I'd reach the bottom step, and something would grab me. But I couldn't stop myself. My legs would move on their own. I'd feel the cold basement floor under my feet, and then, blackness. Hands. Something wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me down. And I'd wake up. I hated that basement. Taking my laundry down was the worst part of my week. I tried to put it off for as long as I could, but eventually, my mom would notice. She'd give me that look, the one that meant I was pushing my luck, and I'd have no choice but to grab my clothes and head down. The basement had two parts. The finished side wasn't too bad. It had a couch, some shelves, and a TV. But the unfinished side, the side with the laundry machine, was different. It was just concrete walls and floors, pipes running along the ceiling, old boxes stacked in the corners. There were tiny, slit-like windows near the ceiling, but they didn't do much. They let in a little bit of light during the day, but at night, they might as well not have been there at all. I never liked going down there, even when the sun was shining. But that day was worse. I was home alone. Well, not completely alone. Our dog was there. She was a mutt, some mix of a retriever and something else, with shaggy fur and too much energy. She was always getting in the way, always looking for attention. I figured if I had to go into the basement, it would be better to take her with me. At least then I wouldn't be alone. So I grabbed my laundry, called her over, and made my way down the stairs. It was fine at first. The daylight was coming through the little windows, making long, angled shapes on the concrete. The machine wasn't running, so the basement was quiet. Too quiet, but I didn't let myself think about it. I walked over to the machine, tossed my clothes onto the pile, and turned back toward the stairs. And then, like always, I ran. I always ran up the basement stairs. I told myself it was stupid, that nothing was behind me, that I was being ridiculous. But that didn't matter. The second I turned away from the laundry pile, the fear hit me like a fist to the gut. My heart pounded, my hands shook, and I had to get out. I barely made a sound when I ran, just the light tap of my feet on the stairs. But this time, there was something else. Thudding. Heavy, frantic thudding. Something was coming up the stairs behind me. My mind shattered. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My legs locked up. My body refused to move. My brain went blank, like it had shut down completely. I crumpled onto the stairs, curling into a ball, waiting for whatever was behind me to get me. For the first time in my life, I was truly convinced I was about to die. All those years of being told monsters weren't real, they were wrong. They were so wrong. Because something was in that basement with me, something was coming up those stairs, and something was about to grab me. I clenched my eyes shut, digging my fingers into my arms, bracing for pain. And then, a warm, wet tongue dragged across my cheek. I gasped, my eyes flying open. My dog. She was wagging her tail, panting excitedly, jumping up and down, her paws scrabbling against the stairs. She thought we were playing. I didn't move at first. I was still too frozen, too flooded with terror. My heart slammed against my ribs. My limbs felt like they were filled with lead. It took me a second, longer than it should have, to process what had happened. The thudding, the scrambling. It had just been her. She had raced me up the stairs. I sucked in a shaky breath, forcing my body to move. My fingers unclenched, my legs uncurled. I slowly sat up, my hands shaking as I pressed them against the steps. My dog gave a happy little bark and licked my face again. I let out something between a laugh and a sob. Then I stood up and bolted out of the basement, my dog bounding after me like nothing had happened. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my mom, not my friends, not anyone. Because how could I? What was I supposed to say? I thought my dog was a monster and almost passed out from fear? No. But that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart still rattling in my chest. I knew that my dog had been the one making the noise. But my brain wouldn't let it go. For a split second, just a second, I had felt something behind me. And even now, even after I knew the truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been down there. That my dog hadn't been the only thing racing up those stairs. I've never been a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything that can't be explained by logic. I've always been the type of guy who would rather double-check the locks than worry about things that go bump in the night. But what happened in our house, what happened with my son, still sticks with me to this day. It all started when my son was about 3 years old. He was a happy kid, talkative, curious, always running around and getting into everything. At that time, we were living in an old 1930s-era craftsman house in Pasadena, California. The house had character, the kind of charm you only get from old wood, high ceilings, and the creaky floors that always let you know when someone was moving. It was the kind of house that felt solid, like it had seen generations come and go, holding on to bits and pieces of every family that had lived there. My wife and I loved the place. It had quirks, sticking doors, dim corners where the light never seemed to reach, and a basement I refused to spend more time in than necessary. But nothing about it felt off. Just old. My wife worked in retail, meaning she often had weekend shifts, and since I worked Monday through Friday, that meant I spent a lot of Saturdays and Sundays alone with our son. I loved it. Those slow weekends, making pancakes, taking him to the park, and watching him race around the house like a little whirlwind, were some of my favorite times. That night, like any other, I was giving him a bath. He was splashing around, playing with his plastic boat, making up some kind of story with little bursts of words and laughter. Then, in the middle of all that normal, innocent fun, he stopped. I noticed it right away. One moment, he was babbling about his boat, and the next, he was looking over my shoulder. Not a quick glance, not a distracted stare. He was focused on something. At first, I thought maybe he was just daydreaming, but the way his little forehead scrunched, the way his eyes tracked something I couldn't see, made my skin prickle. Then he asked, asterisk, why does Grandma call Mommy, my mother-in-law's nickname for my wife? Asterisk. I froze. My mother-in-law, my wife's mom, had passed away when our son was only 4 months old. She and my wife had been incredibly close, and losing her had been devastating. She had a special nickname for my wife, something unique, something only she called her since she was a baby. We never used it. Ever. I turned to face him, forcing my voice to stay steady. Asterisk, what did you say? Asterisk. He looked at me, completely calm, like he'd just asked about the weather. Asterisk, why does Grandma call Mommy, my mother-in-law's nickname for my wife? Asterisk. My mouth felt dry. Asterisk, where did you hear that? Asterisk. He shrugged, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. Asterisk, the farmer told me. Asterisk. A heavy silence settled between us. I could hear the soft drip of the faucet, the shifting water as he absent-mindedly swirled his hand in the tub. My stomach twisted. Asterisk, who's the farmer? Asterisk, I asked carefully. Asterisk, my friend. Asterisk. I didn't know what to say. My son was 3. He had an active imagination, sure, but this wasn't like the stories he usually told. There was something, too, certain about the way he said it. That night, after he went to bed, I told my wife. She sat there, silent, eyes welling up as I repeated the conversation. She didn't say much, just nodded and wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. There was no way for him to know that name. No way. We didn't talk about it, didn't bring it up in casual conversation. It was something private, something that belonged to my wife and her mom alone. We chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe we had mentioned it once, in passing, without realizing it. Maybe it was just one of those weird things kids say. But the name had been buried in my wife's childhood, and our son had unearthed it. That fact gnawed at me. Then, a week later, it happened again. My wife was at work, and I was home, enjoying the quiet while my son played in his room. I was in the kitchen when I heard it, his little voice, chatting away like he was having a full-blown conversation. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk. Asterisk, no. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't know that. Asterisk. Then soft laughter. It wasn't unusual for him to talk to himself while playing, but this didn't sound like the usual make-believe. It had the distinct rhythm of a back-and-forth conversation. I walked to his doorway and peeked in. He was sitting on the floor, a few toy cars scattered around him. He wasn't playing, though. He was looking at something, head slightly tilted, as if listening. Asterisk, who are you talking to? Asterisk, I asked, keeping my voice light. He turned to me, expression neutral. Asterisk, the farmer. Asterisk. I felt an icy trickle down my spine. Asterisk, where is he? Asterisk. He blinked and then, just as casually, said, Asterisk, he left when you came in. Asterisk. I didn't like that. That night, I told my wife again. This time, she was visibly unsettled. She kept rubbing her arms like she was cold, even though the house was warm. We agreed to keep an eye on it. If it happened again, if it escalated, we'd do something. But we didn't know what. A few nights later, something woke me. At first, I didn't know why. The house was still. No creaks, no movement. I turned my head slightly and saw my wife shift beside me, also stirring. Then we both heard it. A small voice, coming from our son's room. Asterisk, Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore. Asterisk. The words were soft, almost sleepy, but they hit me like a fist to the gut. My wife and I sat up at the same time. I pushed the blankets off and moved quickly down the hall, my wife right behind me. When we reached his room, he was just sitting up in bed. Awake. We checked on him, asked if he was okay. He nodded, looking at us like we were the ones acting strange. Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore, he said simply. I didn't know what to say. Neither did my wife. We tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and went back to bed. And that was it. He never mentioned the farmer again. Not once. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. Years passed. We never brought it up, never reminded him of it. He's 13 now, a normal, happy kid. If I asked him about it, he wouldn't remember. But we do. When I was 10, my dad and I moved to a new town. I didn't know anyone except for a family he was close friends with. It was a single mom, Karen, with 3 kids. The oldest, Jenna, was 2 years older than me, which seemed like a huge gap at the time. But we were neighbors, and over the next couple of years, we became friendly. We didn't hang out all the time, but we shared the same circle of friends, and I always felt like there was something off about her. Jenna wasn't exactly what you'd call normal. It wasn't something I could put my finger on. It was just this odd energy that followed her. But she wasn't the weirdest person I knew, so I didn't think too much of it. One evening, Rob, a friend of mine, was hanging out with Jenna and her younger brother, Max. Karen, their mom, worked nights at a local diner, so they were alone at the house. Rob wasn't supposed to be there, but he didn't care. He had his reasons. He was always a little rebellious. When he told me later that night what happened, I could barely wrap my head around it. It started with a knock at the door. Jenna answered it without thinking, probably thinking it was her mom, Karen, coming home. The knock was a specific pattern that Karen had, so it didn't raise any alarms for Jenna. Rob, though, was freaked out. He wasn't supposed to be there, and the thought of being caught by Karen didn't sit well with him. He quickly ducked out the window and sprinted home without a second thought, not realizing just how bad things were about to get. When Jenna opened the door, it wasn't Karen. It was a woman, much older than Jenna, with an unsettling aura. She introduced herself as someone Karen had been helping through work. She claimed she needed to speak to Karen urgently. Jenna, still thinking it was just some business related to her mom's job, let her in without hesitation. What she didn't know was that this woman was far more than she appeared. Turns out, the woman was the sister of someone Karen had been helping, a woman who had been in a mental institution for years but was recently released. The two women had kept in touch, and through conversations about her family, she'd figured out where Karen lived and when she'd be working. I don't know the details of what happened next, and honestly, I'm relieved that I don't. But Rob told me that Max, Jenna's younger brother, was the one who realized something wasn't right. He slipped out the back and ran to the neighbor's house, desperately trying to get help. By the time anyone got there, it was already too late. Jenna was found a week before Christmas, and it was one of those things you just don't forget. She was gone, and not just in a simple way. She had been attacked, violently, in her own home. Her body was left in a way that was just wrong. The police investigation was horrible, and I didn't want to know all the details, but the whole town knew. The head was hidden somewhere in the house, tucked away among the Christmas presents, like it was a sick joke. It was so grotesque, so unnecessary. The woman was arrested, and the trial made headlines for weeks. But what stood out to me the most was how unreal everything felt. A place that used to feel like home, a place I had known as a safe space, suddenly became this dark, dreadful place. My mind couldn't let go of the image of Jenna's face, the girl I had known in passing, the one who had been there for a brief, shining moment of time, and then was gone. It haunted me. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. My parents didn't think it was right for me to be there, given everything I had already heard. They didn't want me to witness something so disturbing. I didn't understand at the time, but now, I think they were just trying to protect me. The whole community was shaken. People started locking doors at night. Families kept their kids closer. No one felt safe. I thought about that night often. It wasn't just the act itself that disturbed me, but the way things had spiraled out of control so quickly. Rob never came over to my place again after that. The silence that followed in the months after Jenna's death was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. The house she had grown up in stood empty for a while, and people stopped talking about her. Well, at least openly. But I couldn't forget. I never saw Max again after that night. He and his mom moved away, and the house was sold. I heard whispers now and then that Karen had a hard time recovering from the loss, but no one really knew for sure. It's not the kind of thing you talk about with strangers. Years later, I found out that the woman who did it had been living under a false identity. She had a history of mental illness, and no one knew she had slipped through the cracks until it was too late. What happened to her after she was arrested? I never really followed up on it. It didn't seem to matter anymore. I still can't wrap my head around what happened, or why it had to happen the way it did. It left me with this lingering sense of dread, like the safety I had once felt was a lie. The world suddenly felt more unpredictable, more dangerous, and the idea that someone could enter your home, someone you didn't even know, and destroy everything, it's a thought that's hard to shake off. Life continued, though. Time passed. I grew up, moved on, but I never forgot Jenna, and I never will. Two years ago, I never could have predicted what was coming. A breakup should have been just that, a separation of two people who grew apart. But instead, what I went through was a nightmare, one that I still can't fully shake off. There's a part of me that wishes it were a bad dream, but it wasn't. It was real, and it left scars I wasn't prepared for. The relationship was toxic, like a slow burn that gradually started to tear us apart. I saw the signs but ignored them, thinking I could change things, that it was just a rough patch. I should have left earlier, I know that now. But hindsight is always clearer than the view at the time. What hurt the most was how I came to realize the truth about her, about us. She had deep emotional issues I wasn't aware of, or maybe I just didn't see them. She wasn't the person I thought she was. In the beginning, everything had been good, fun, easy. Then the cracks began to show. Little lies, things that didn't add up, arguments that never seemed to end. Anger. A lot of anger. And somewhere in there, I began to lose myself. It's funny how quickly the word love can lose its meaning, and how fragile it can be when you see the lies behind it. The more I tried to fix things, the worse it got. And then, just like that, she dumped me. Repeatedly. I could barely keep up with it. Every time she left, I was left broken, trying to understand what had happened, what went wrong. But it wasn't until I accepted it, finally admitted to myself that it was over, that things truly took a turn for the worse. 3 weeks after our primary breakup, I started seeing someone new. I thought it was just the right thing to do. Move on, start fresh. But that decision set something off in her. She was furious. She couldn't stand the idea of me moving on, of me being happy without her. I wasn't perfect either, I know that. But nothing justified what came next. One afternoon, I was sitting at home, the weight of everything still heavy in my chest, when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, there she was. The woman I thought I knew, standing there with a bag of her stuff in hand. She'd come to collect what was left behind. I could feel the anger radiating off her, even before she spoke. She shoved past me without saying a word and headed straight for the bedroom. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice flat but sharp. I wasn't sure what was coming, but I could already feel the tension rising. I followed her into the room, wondering why she couldn't just take her things and leave like a normal person. But no, she had something else in mind. She sat me down on the bed, and without another word, she handed me a letter. It was folded neatly, the edges crisp and clean. My stomach sank. I didn't want to read it. I knew whatever was in that letter wasn't going to be kind, but I didn't want to fight with her. I just wanted it to be over. "Read it," she said, out loud. I looked at her face. Her eyes were cold, like a stranger's. I wanted to walk away, just leave. But instead, I opened the letter. I couldn't even finish the first sentence before I felt my hands shaking. The words were cruel. "You're incapable of love," it said. "You're a terrible person. You deserve to die." I didn't want to read any more, but she was staring at me, waiting, her fists clenched. "Keep going," she ordered. I read. I read the entire thing, each word feeling like a punch to my gut. By the time I was done, I felt exhausted, defeated. It was like all the anger she'd been holding onto was now pouring out of her, spilling over and soaking into everything. She wasn't done, though. I could see it in her eyes. The rage hadn't burned out. It was still there, simmering. She pulled out a gun from her purse. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't breathe for a second. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be real. But it was. The cold steel glinted in the light as she aimed it at me. I don't know how much time passed in those next moments. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my ears. The fear started to take over, but I tried my hardest not to show it. She wasn't really going to pull the trigger. She wasn't a killer. At least, I kept telling myself that. She just stared at me, like she was trying to make up her mind. For the longest time, she just held the gun, her finger hovering over the trigger. Her face twisted in something between rage and uncertainty. My throat was dry, my whole body frozen in place. "I know the law," she said, almost casually. "I know what will happen. I'll go to prison, but I don't care. You'll be gone, and that's all that matters." I wasn't sure how I kept my voice steady, but somehow I did. "You're not a killer," I said. "You don't want this. Please, just put it down and go live your life. Please, I'm not worth this. I'm not worth destroying yourself over." She didn't say anything, just stared at me, the silence hanging between us like a thick fog. I could feel the tears threatening to spill, but I refused to let them fall. I needed to stay calm. If I lost it, everything would spiral. She'd see my fear, and that might be the thing that pushes her to do it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she slowly lowered the gun. It wasn't like a sudden decision. It was more like a gradual release, like the tension finally giving way. She didn't say anything as she put the gun back into her purse. She just stood there, breathing heavily, her shoulders slumped, the rage drained from her. For a moment, we were both silent. "Please just go," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond at first, but then she nodded. It was so quiet, the whole room felt frozen in that moment. Then, without another word, she walked out. I heard the door close behind her, and it was like the weight of the world finally lifted off my shoulders. I didn't know if I should feel relieved or terrified. I sat there for a long time, not knowing how to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes. The way she seemed so sure of what she was going to do, like it was her only way out. I didn't see her again after that day. And in a strange way, that was the most unsettling part. We never spoke. She never called. She just disappeared from my life, and I didn't know if that was better or worse. Months passed, and I tried to move on, though I carried the weight of that day with me. The scars, both physical and emotional, took a long time to heal. I heard she got engaged a couple of months ago. It didn't surprise me. She always had a way of moving on quickly, like she could leave everything behind and just start fresh. I hope she's happy now, wherever she is. I don't know what happened to her, or if she's still the same person, but that's not my burden anymore. It's hers to carry. As for me, I learned a lot from that experience. Not just about her, but about myself. I realized that I wasn't perfect, but I'm not the person she tried to make me out to be. I'm still here, and I still have my life to live. And that, in itself, is a victory. I was always the younger and soft brother, so when my oldest brother, Jack, invited me out hunting, it felt like a privilege. Jack was a natural when it came to hunting, and in all the years I spent with him, I never saw anyone more skilled. He could spot game from distances that were almost unreal, and his aim was nearly perfect. I still remember the first time we went out together, and he used my shoulder as a rest to take down a crow I couldn't even see. The way it just exploded in the air, like he had known it was coming even before we saw it, there was something terrifying about it. At the time, I didn't understand why he never missed, but as I spent more time in the woods with him, I learned. Jack had a gift. He saw things other people didn't. There were plenty of times when we would be out for hours, tracking foxes or deer, and I'd be completely lost in my own thoughts, struggling to pick out a trail, while Jack would spot something in the distance, and before I could even ask what he was looking at, he'd already set up and gotten a shot off. He was a machine, a predator, but one that worked with the land, never against it. But that day, winter's grip was still tight on the land, and we were out fox hunting, looking for signs of life in the cold, still woods. Foxes, as anyone who has hunted them knows, are tricky. They're smart, cunning creatures that use their intelligence to survive, and they make hunting them more difficult than most animals. They're not like deer that leave clear tracks in the snow or the predictable movements of smaller animals. Foxes are elusive, and in winter, they can be especially tough to catch because they tend to sleep on top of hills where the sun warms them up, making them harder to spot. That day started like most others, though it was colder than usual, with frost hanging in the trees and snow covering the ground like a thick blanket. We were moving along, tracking along a trail that had little more than the signs of animal tracks and some broken branches. The world was quieter than usual, and all I could hear was the crunch of the snow under our boots and the occasional rustle of branches swaying in the wind. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Jack suddenly whispered, "Stop. Down." It wasn't like he was excited, but there was an urgency in his voice that told me something was off. I froze, immediately dropping to my knees as Jack did the same, a low whisper moving through the trees. "Do you see it?" he muttered. I couldn't. I scanned the hills, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. "There," Jack said, pointing toward the top of a hill about 300 yards away. I could barely make out the shape in the distance, something small and curled up, barely visible against the white snow. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, but it looked like a fox, all curled up, probably basking in the weak sunlight. Jack was already setting up his rifle, moving silently like a shadow, his eyes fixed on the target. I stayed still, not wanting to disturb him. He was methodical, precise. He had already flipped the safety off the rifle, and his finger was hovering just above the trigger. I could feel my heart starting to pound in my chest, the anticipation, the tension building. We were close, so close. Just as I was about to ask him what he was waiting for, something happened that I didn't expect. The fox, or whatever it was, started to move. It didn't spring to its feet like I thought it might. No, it did something even stranger. It did a perfect 180-degree turn on the snow, without even uncoiling from its ball-like position. In that moment, my stomach dropped, and I felt a cold rush of panic wash over me. The fox was moving too slowly, too methodically to be real. Jack's finger tensed on the trigger. It felt like the air around us went still, like time itself slowed down. I thought for a second that maybe Jack had missed his shot, but then the figure turned again. This time it was clear. It wasn't a fox at all. My blood ran cold. The figure, no, the shape, was wearing a fox hat. A goddamn fox hat. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing at first, the brain struggling to process the absurdity of it all. A person had been lying there, on top of that hill, pretending to be a fox, hiding in the snow. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was standing up, pulling the fur-lined hat off their head and throwing it aside. The person didn't even seem to notice us yet. For a moment, everything felt wrong, like my mind was struggling to piece together what had just happened. The person, a man by the looks of him, was standing there, looking at us like we were the ones who had done something out of place. I didn't even know how to react. We had just been seconds away from what could have been a deadly mistake. Jack's rifle was still raised, his fingers still on the trigger. His hand wasn't shaking, but his expression had shifted. I could see his jaw clench, his eyes narrowing, and I could sense the anger starting to build in him. He was always calm, always in control, but not now. Not after this. The man, probably realizing how close he had come to death, stood frozen for a moment, then slowly began to back away, his hands raised. He wasn't armed, but that didn't matter much. The situation had escalated far beyond what either of us had expected. I could hear Jack's voice, low and controlled, even as his grip tightened on the rifle. "What the hell are you doing on my land?" The man didn't answer. He kept backing away, his eyes locked on Jack's rifle. I wasn't sure whether he was just stunned or afraid, but he didn't make any sudden moves. For a moment, time seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. I stood there, still in shock, trying to make sense of it all. How had we missed him? How had Jack been so close to taking the shot, and yet, at the last moment, spared this idiot's life? It was like we had been in a race with fate, and only by the sheerest of chances had we avoided something terrible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man turned and began walking away, still keeping his hands raised in surrender. Jack didn't take his eyes off him for a second, and I watched the man disappear into the woods, like a ghost vanishing into the white expanse. The tension in the air didn't immediately dissipate, but slowly, bit by bit, I could feel the grip of fear easing off of me. Jack lowered his rifle, but his eyes were still scanning the trees, his face unreadable. I could see the storm of thoughts behind his eyes, wondering how close he had come to making a terrible mistake. We didn't speak for a long time, just standing there in the snow, listening to the world around us, unsure of what to say next. The sound of the snow crunching underfoot was deafening in the silence. Eventually, Jack turned to me, his expression hardening. "We don't shoot unless we're sure," he said. His voice was cold, like he had learned something today that I didn't fully understand yet. "You always make sure." "Always." I nodded, still processing everything that had happened. We stayed out there for a while longer, moving cautiously through the woods, but the feeling of unease never really went away. It wasn't just the fact that we had almost killed a man, it was that we were so close to it without ever realizing it. The rest of the hunt was uneventful, but it was impossible to shake the feeling of what had almost happened. The way we had almost pulled the trigger on a person, thinking they were an animal, it was something I would carry with me forever. Jack never spoke about that day again, but I knew it stayed with him too. The lines between life and death are thin, and sometimes they're thinner than you think. In the end, we didn't get our fox, but we did learn something that day. Sometimes you're not just hunting animals. Sometimes you're hunting people, and sometimes they're hunting you back. It was the end of my freshman year at college. My time in the dorms had been a blur of late nights, new friendships, and the usual excitement that comes with being away from home for the first time. The atmosphere was lively, everyone rushing through finals week, each person navigating the stress in their own way. I had a great roommate, and everything felt normal, until the very end of the semester when something began to change. The first few weeks of the semester, the dorms were the usual mix of social chaos, study sessions, and random bursts of energy. But by the time finals were just around the corner, something felt off. I can't explain it well. There was this oppressive heaviness in the air whenever I entered the dorms, a dread that seemed to cling to the walls. It was subtle at first, a slight unease that wasn't there before, but as the days went on, it intensified. It wasn't the stress of finals. I've lived through that before. No, this was something different. It was late one night, a few days before my final exam, when I decided I needed a shower. Studying in my room for hours on end had me feeling sluggish, and I figured a quick shower would help wake me up for the remaining grind. The hall was quiet when I stepped out of my room, just a few dim lights casting long shadows along the floor. I was half distracted, half relieved to be stepping away from my textbooks for a moment, but as I made my way to the bathroom, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it. The bathroom was always a place where I could take a break from the world. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. I'd been in there dozens of times without issue, but tonight, everything felt different. The steel door to the bathroom was cracked open, propped against a wooden wedge, the same way it had always been. As I walked closer, the door creaked slightly on its hinges, sending a chill down my spine. I pushed it open. The bathroom layout wasn't anything special, but in my mind, it was now tied to something far more sinister. Two sets of sinks lined the left and right walls, their mirrors facing one another. You could stand at one sink and see the reflection of the other sink, but more unsettlingly, you could see into the showers if the door was open. At the far end of the room were the urinals and a single toilet stall, but the showers had always been the area I avoided in this place. I couldn't explain why, but something about that corner always gave me an uneasy feeling. I didn't think much of it though. I was just going to grab my things, get in and out, and get back to studying. I laid my change of clothes on the counter by the right side sinks and went to the stall. Everything seemed normal. The white tiles, the dull fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Nothing seemed off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I stood there, reaching for my shower supplies, I happened to glance up into the mirror. I froze. The corner of my eye caught something out of place. At first, I thought it was my reflection playing tricks, but no. There, in the distance, just beyond the first layer of mirrors, was something moving. I couldn't make it out at first. It was faint, a shimmering shape that seemed to shift and bend with each passing second. It was in the farthest layer of reflection, and then, without warning, it shifted. The shimmer jumped, moving from one layer of the mirror to the next, getting closer. My breath hitched in my chest. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my ears, unsure whether I was seeing things or if it was really happening. It didn't make sense. My mind tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to exhaustion, the overload of Red Bull, Adderall, and caffeine coursing through my veins. But there was something so distinctly wrong about it. The shape kept moving, jumping closer, layer by layer. Now, it wasn't just a shimmer. I could make out the details, but they weren't right. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could explain. It looked like a dark mass, but there was something that made me shudder to my core. It wasn't hair. It was like a long, flowing veil that moved unnaturally, almost like it was alive. The upper portion of it was semi-transparent, and I could see through it. But from the torso down, it was just solid black, like the void itself. My pulse quickened. Panic set in. The closer it got, the more it became real. I was unable to look away, though every instinct screamed at me to run. It was like the thing was moving toward me. No, it was closing in on the reflection of me, inch by inch, like it was drawn to my presence. My mind scrambled to process it. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe my brain had just short-circuited. But then, it reached the fourth layer, and that's when I saw its face, or at least the semblance of one. The eyes. They were black, glowing faintly, but not like the glow of light. It was darker than that, an unsettling sheen. I don't know how to explain it. It was human, but not. It was there, but at the same time, it felt like it wasn't. Something alien, something ancient. And then the lights flickered, cutting off entirely. Everything was plunged into darkness. I could still hear the shower running. At least I thought it was the shower, but the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. I froze. The temperature seemed to drop, and an oppressive weight filled the air. I fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. My hands were slick with sweat, my breathing shallow and quick. I heard it before I saw anything, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud. The steel door. But there was no one there. Nothing. The room was silent. And then the smell. It hit me like a wave. The metallic, pungent scent of blood. It was so overpowering that it felt like it was clogging my throat. I gagged, struggling to breathe. The sound of my own heartbeat rang in my ears. My vision blurred, and everything around me felt distorted. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold bathroom floor. The darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in a hospital room, the white walls and sterile smell greeting me like an unwelcome guest. The steady beeping of machines beside me was a constant reminder that I was no longer in that dorm bathroom. My parents were there, their worried faces etched with concern, but all I could think of was what had happened, what I had seen. My RA had found me. I vaguely remembered him running to the bathroom after hearing something, finding me there in the shower stall, shirt covered in blood. I had no memory of how I got there. The last thing I remembered was that suffocating scent of blood and that dark figure. According to my RA, all I could say when I came to was, "It saw me." I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what had happened. It didn't make sense. The doctors couldn't explain it either. They ran tests, CAT scans, everything they could think of. They said it was a seizure, but there was no sign of one. No brain activity that indicated a seizure had taken place. And worse still, I had never experienced anything like that before. Not with my history of Adderall or anything else. It didn't add up. For days afterward, I struggled to make sense of what happened. But I couldn't. There were no other reports of any similar incidents at the dorms. Nothing. It was an isolated event, something that had happened to me and me alone. Everyone had written it off as stress, exhaustion, maybe even the combination of drugs and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't a product of my mind playing tricks. It was too vivid, too real. Now, for years later, I still can't look into mirrors for too long. If I'm in a room with one for an extended period, I start to panic. My chest tightens. My breathing becomes erratic. The images of that thing still haunt me. Therapy has helped a bit, but it doesn't erase the fear. Every night, before I go to bed, I check the bathroom. I check the shadows. I'm terrified that one day, it might find me again. I've spoken to religious leaders, trying to find answers, but none have been able to explain it. They tell me to pray, to seek peace and faith, but none have recognized what I described as anything other than a mental breakdown. And maybe that's all it was, but deep down, I know what I saw. I don't know why it happened, or why it stuck with me for so long. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, that thing, I don't think it was something meant to be seen. It wasn't just the darkness. It wasn't just the terror. It was the eyes. And for the first time in my life, I realized that some things are better left unseen. It was a hot, sticky summer night, the kind of evening that made the air feel thick and suffocating. My mom and I had just moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment after my parents separated, and everything felt unfamiliar. My mom tried to make it feel like home, but I could tell she was still adjusting. She had her own room, and I had mine across the hallway, but I didn't like being alone at night, especially after everything that had happened. So, when I stayed at her place, I preferred to sleep in her bed, tucked under the sheets next to her, with her comforting presence beside me. Her room was the kind of place that smelled faintly of lavender and fabric softener, with a small window behind the headboard that let in a cool breeze when it was open. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside was often the only thing that kept me calm enough to fall asleep. That night, I remember the window was open, and the air felt a little cooler than usual for a summer evening. It was just past midnight when I woke up, disoriented and not quite sure what had disturbed my sleep. I wasn't scared at first. I simply sat up in bed, blinking into the darkness, trying to make sense of the world around me. That's when I saw him, our cat, Midnight, sitting in the door frame of my mom's room. His glossy black fur glimmered faintly in the moonlight, but something about his posture was off. He wasn't curled up on the bed with us like usual. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his eyes glowing in the dark, staring into the hallway beyond. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Midnight was a strange cat, but he'd never acted like this before. He usually stayed close by, either curled up next to my mom or me, or chasing shadows around the apartment. I watched him for a moment, trying to figure out what he was doing. Then, without making a sound, he got up and walked into my bedroom. The soft padding of his paws on the floor was the only noise in the stillness of the night. As he walked past me, he looked up at me, his green eyes reflecting the dim light from the hallway. He meowed once, a low, almost mournful sound that echoed in the silence. I turned to face my mom, ready to wake her up. I didn't know why I felt the need to, but it felt like something wasn't right. My heart began to race as I leaned closer to her, whispering her name, trying to get her attention. It only took a few seconds for her to stir, groggily asking me what was wrong. But then, in that split second, something shifted. I turned my head back to the doorframe, my eyes widening in disbelief. Standing just inside the doorway, in the shadow of the hall, was a man. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, wearing a dark jacket that seemed to blend with the darkness around him. His face was obscured, but I could make out the outline of his body, his silhouette moving slowly, deliberately. The man didn't say anything. He didn't even make a sound as he started to move, stepping quietly into my room. My blood ran cold. I didn't even have time to scream. My mom must have seen it too, because in the next moment, she was moving faster than I had ever seen her move before. Without a word, she grabbed me, throwing the blankets aside and lifting me out of bed with a strength I didn't know she had. There was no hesitation. She was terrified, but she was also determined. "Hold on," she whispered urgently. In one swift motion, she threw me out of the window. I felt the cool night air rush past me, and my heart nearly stopped as I realized what was happening. But before I could fully process it, I landed on the grass below with a soft thud. My feet hit the ground first, and I stumbled slightly, but the drop wasn't far, just a few feet to the grass, thank God. Before I could even stand up fully, my mom was following, jumping out the window after me with surprising agility for someone her age. I scrambled to my feet, panicking, my mind racing. We didn't know what was going on or how the man had gotten in, but we knew we had to get out of there. My mom grabbed my hand, and we both started running toward the parking lot, screaming for help. I had never seen her so afraid, but in that moment, I realized just how much she was willing to do to protect me. We didn't stop running until we reached the street, where the lights from nearby houses made everything feel a little safer. It felt like hours before someone came outside, hearing our screams. The neighbor across the way called 911. The police arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices calm but firm as they surveyed the scene. But there was nothing to find. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. The apartment was locked up tight, just like my mom had said. The only thing out of place was the unlocked front door. My mom swore up and down that she had locked it. The deadbolt was in place. The chain lock was secure. How could it have been open? The officers seemed skeptical, but didn't have an explanation. They chalked it up to the possibility that the man had slipped in while the door was briefly left unlocked. Maybe when we were busy or distracted earlier that evening. But I knew in my gut that wasn't it. Something was wrong. Something was off about the whole situation. Over the next few days, the fear didn't go away. My mom didn't sleep well, and neither did I. We kept talking about the man we'd seen, but neither of us could make sense of it. Then, about a week later, while my mom was cleaning, she opened the door to our water heater closet. Inside, she found something that made her blood run cold. A small notebook lay on the floor, tucked behind a pile of cleaning supplies. She picked it up and opened it, her fingers trembling. The pages were filled with strange drawings, sketches of people, some of them with excess over their faces, others with dark, jagged lines drawn through their features. The notebook was unsettling, but it didn't stop there. Along with it, there were a pair of gloves and some chewed-up gum wrappers, crumpled and half-hidden behind the shelves. My mom's face turned pale as she held the notebook in her hands, her eyes darting around the room, as if she expected the man to step out from the shadows. She called the police again, and they came to investigate, but once more, there was nothing they could do. The notebook and the gloves didn't belong to anyone they knew. There were no fingerprints, no evidence to link them to the man who had been in our apartment that night. All they could do was speculate. They said the man must have been hiding in the apartment when we went to bed, waiting until we were asleep before he made his move. But how had he gotten in? And why had he left so quietly? It didn't make sense. The police left after a few hours, their presence offering little comfort. My mom locked every door and window from that day on, even when we were just in the apartment. We didn't speak much about what had happened after that night. It was too terrifying, too incomprehensible. I still think about it sometimes. The man in the doorway, the way he had moved so quietly, like a shadow. The notebook and the gloves that my mom found, the eerie feeling that we were being watched even when we weren't aware of it. It was the kind of experience that doesn't fully make sense. It's a memory that lingers, but the questions never really get answered. I don't know who that man was or how he got into our apartment, but I do know that we were lucky to get out of there when we did. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us that night. Maybe it was just a random, terrifying event. Or maybe it was something else, something that we'll never fully understand. Either way, it was a night I'll never forget. I grew up in a house on Long Island, in the town of Brentwood. For its location, it was quiet, more trees than people, more stillness than noise. The roads were lined with old houses, some with overgrown yards, others well-kept but aged by time. Ours sat near the end of the street, a modest two-story with a backyard big enough for a pool. My parents were proud of it. It was a step up from the cramped apartment we'd lived in before. My dad worked as a taxi driver. His shifts were unpredictable, sometimes bringing him home just after midnight, sometimes not until the early morning. I was used to waking up and hearing the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, the shuffle of his feet on the porch. He'd always tell me stories about the people he picked up, the drunks, the talkers, the ones who sat silent the whole ride. Some were funny, some were strange, but they always felt like tiny glimpses into a world I hadn't seen yet. It was a Saturday morning when the first strange thing happened. I was sitting in the living room watching cartoons, the sound of bright, exaggerated voices filling the space. The sky outside was still a dull shade of blue, the world not quite awake yet. I heard my dad's car pull in, the door shut, and the familiar jingle of his keys. I ran to the door to greet him, and he smiled, ruffling my hair like always. Then we heard it. "Hello, honey, don't go in the pool. It's not ready yet." It was my mother's voice, clear as day, coming from the back of the house. I remember how casually my dad and I reacted at first. We just glanced at each other, amused. It was early. Maybe she thought we were planning on jumping into the water at sunrise. But the thing was, my mom wasn't home. It was Saturday. She had left for work long before my dad even got back. We both stood there for a moment, our easy smiles fading. The house was silent again, nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the TV in the background. My dad walked through the rooms, checking for anything unusual. The back door was locked. The pool cover was still on. Nothing had been touched. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't fully understand at the time. It wasn't like hearing footsteps or seeing something move out of the corner of your eye. It was a voice, familiar, unmistakable, coming from inside our home. But we brushed it off. What else could we do? A few weeks passed, and we settled into life in the new house. I started getting familiar with the neighborhood, the kids on the block, the streets where people didn't mind if you rode your bike in the middle of the road. It was summer when our new neighbors came by to introduce themselves. There were two mothers, both friendly, smiling. They had 4 kids between them, 2 boys, one my age, the other in 10th grade, and 2 little girls. One of the girls was blonde, loud, and quick to talk. The other was quieter, dark-haired, standing close to her mother like she wasn't sure about being there at all. After the usual greetings, the moms let us go off to play. We started kicking around a soccer ball in my backyard, running between the trees, the grass still damp from the sprinklers that had gone off earlier in the morning. But as we played, I realized something. The quiet brunette girl wasn't there. I was a curious kid. I liked knowing things, figuring things out. So I ran off, searching the edges of the yard, calling out for her. It didn't take long to find her. She was at the back of the property, just past the fence, standing at the edge of the woods. I remember the way she stood, completely still, like she was listening for something. I stepped closer, kicking twigs out of my way. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, small and quick, and asked, "Do you want to play tag?" Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I didn't know why, but I shook my head. "We should get everyone to play," I told her. Her smile faded. I ran back to the others, calling for them to join. I barely got the words out before I noticed the way they were looking at me, confused, almost uneasy. One of the mothers spoke up. "Who are you talking about?" I pointed toward the woods. "The little girl, the quiet one." Their confusion turned into something else. A kind of stiff, uncomfortable silence. "We only have one daughter," she said. My mouth went dry. I turned back toward the trees, my heart beating too fast. The girl was gone. Later, I overheard my parents talking. They had been chatting with one of the older neighbors. a man who had lived on the street for years. He told them about the previous owners of our house. A family had lived there, parents, 2 kids. The little girl, dark-haired and quiet, had drowned in the pool 10 years ago. Her mother had died of a heart attack not long after. I stood in the hallway, listening, my skin cold. I thought about the voice we had heard that first morning. I thought about the girl in the woods. The next 5 or 6 years were filled with things I couldn't explain. There were nights when I'd wake up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside my door. I'd stare at the ceiling, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. It never did, but I always knew when it was going to be one of those nights, because the air would feel heavier, like the whole house was waiting for something. There were times when things moved. Small things, but enough to notice. A chair slightly out of place. A book left open to a page I hadn't read yet. Once, when I was about 13, I had a friend sleep over. We were playing video games in my room when he stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I hadn't, but when I turned the volume down, the house was too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We didn't sleep much that night. As I got older, I learned to ignore the strange things, or at least pretend I didn't notice them. The house had a way of making you feel like you were imagining things, like maybe it was just in your head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I moved out when I was 18. My parents sold the house a few years later. I never went back. But sometimes late at night, I still think about it. The voice that called out that morning. The girl in the woods. The way the house always felt like it was listening. And I wonder if the new owners ever hear their names being called when no one else is home. I've always loved the independence that came with living on my own. Well, sort of. I lived in a big, old house with 5 Navy guys. They were all great roommates, but it was still an odd setup. There was something about that house that always made me feel a little uneasy. Maybe it was because my room was in the detached garage, separate from the main house. It wasn't the most glamorous space, but I liked it, peaceful, quiet, with just me and my dog. That night, I was exhausted. It had been a long week, work, errands, trying to keep up with everything. I'd barely finished a late dinner when I finally crawled into bed. My dog, a black lab, was already curled up next to me, as usual, content to sleep through the night. I was too tired to even think about the door being locked, but I had started double-checking it after reading some unsettling stuff on Reddit. Even though our neighborhood was quiet, it never hurt to be cautious. As I drifted off to sleep, I remember hearing something faint, almost like the wind rattling something outside. But the sound grew louder, more pronounced, like someone was shaking something, or even pounding on it. I didn't know what it was at first. It sounded like a door being knocked on. But the thing was, it wasn't coming from the walls or the windows. It was coming from the door to the garage. I woke up slowly, my mind foggy, still trying to piece together what was happening. The rattling noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. I opened my eyes, disoriented, and blinked into the darkness of my room. My dog was awake now, his body rigid, staring at the door. His eyes were fixed on the knob, and I could see him tense up as the rattling continued. The door handle was shaking violently, like someone was trying to open it from the outside. No knocking, just this frantic jiggling and banging. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't make my body move. Fear slammed into my chest, making it hard to breathe. I felt paralyzed, my mind racing with all sorts of terrifying thoughts. It was too real to be a dream. My room, usually so still and calm, now felt like a trap. The door handle rattled again, followed by a faint pounding sound. My dog growled low, and I could feel the tension in his body. I glanced around looking for something, anything, to defend myself. But I couldn't find anything, just a flashlight on the nightstand. Not much of a weapon, but it was all I had. I grabbed it, clutching it tightly, my palms sweaty, and pulled the covers over my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding in my ears. The noise continued for what felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. Complete silence. My heart was still racing, and I was left trying to figure out what to do. My mind was foggy, and my body was shaking, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I peeled the covers off and sat up, trying to steady my breath. I had to know what was happening. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. One of the guys, drunk after a night out, maybe. That was the logical explanation. right? But nothing felt logical in that moment. I glanced over at my watch. It was 2:30 a.m. I couldn't stay in the room. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of bed, moving cautiously toward the closet. It had a window at the top, and I climbed up onto the bench beneath it, poking my head above the edge to look outside. The motion light by the back door flickered on as I watched, the beam lighting up the small patch of yard outside the garage. The night felt eerily still. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The motion light flickered off a few moments later. I hurried back to my bed, my mind working overtime. I lived with 5 guys who often had people over after a night out. Could it be someone stumbling around in a drunken haze, just messing with me? I didn't want to overreact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. With trembling hands, I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a message to my roommates, trying to keep my tone light, but every word felt heavy as I typed. Asterisk. Hey guys, are you up? Do you have people over? Someone was just outside my door trying to get in. I assumed someone must be drunk or something. Kinda creepy. Asterisk. I waited for a response. A few minutes passed, then the back door of the main house slammed open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, followed by whistling and what sounded like banging. My heart dropped into my stomach. My roommates were up. I rushed to the door of the garage, opening it slowly, and looked out into the yard. I could see 2 of my roommates running toward the back fence, baseball bats in their hands. My dog, now anxious and alert, barked and ran out behind me. I wasn't sure what was going on, but my roommates had clearly woken up in a panic. One of them had heard the noise and gotten another guy up. They'd gone outside to patrol the yard, scanning for anything that might have been lurking in the dark. The tension in the air was thick, and I felt a knot in my stomach as I realized just how vulnerable I had been out here alone. My mind kept racing back to the rattling door, to the pounding sound. What if it hadn't stopped? What if they hadn't been there to wake up and help? After a few minutes, I went inside the main house, my hands still shaking. My roommates spent the next couple of hours patrolling, checking every window, looking for anything unusual. It wasn't until dawn that they finally stopped, having found nothing, but they did find something odd. A pack of cigarettes in the backyard and a half-eaten bag of Hardee's. Someone had been out there, and they'd been watching. I stayed up for the rest of the night, watching my roommates sweep the yard again. We never saw anyone, but I knew now just how close it had come. It wasn't a drunken prank or some random, harmless mishap. It felt like a robbery that never went through. Whoever it was must have seen the 6 cars parked in the driveway and figured the garage would be an easier target. As the night wore on, the adrenaline slowly left my body, but I could feel the lingering fear inside me. The thought of what could have happened, of how close I came to being trapped, stayed with me long after the sun came up. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but I also didn't feel safe for weeks afterward. It wasn't just the fear of what happened, it was the realization that, without my roommates waking up, without them checking, I might never have known who was outside my door. It took me nearly 3 weeks before I could sleep in my room again. Even then, every creak of the house, every flicker of the motion lights outside, made my heart race. It was strange, knowing that I was living in a place where, for all the noise and activity of my roommates, I could still feel so completely alone. The feeling didn't really go away. And even now, when I look back, I don't know whether it was just some random drunk or someone looking for something more. But that night, I learned how fragile safety can be and how quickly things can go wrong. I'll never forget the sound of that door rattling. I don't think I'll ever forget that day, no matter how many years pass. Sometimes, when I look back, I feel like I was just a dumb kid who got scared over nothing. But then I remember the news report, and I remember how close we came to something terrible. We lived in an old house on the outskirts of town, one of those places that had been standing for over 100 years. It had been through wars, floods, storms. The wood creaked in the wind like it was still settling into the land, even after all that time. The back of our yard stretched far, leading into an overgrown cemetery. That was the first thing people always noticed about our house. The cemetery wasn't exactly hidden. It was just there, beyond the line of trees, a part of the land like anything else. Most of the graves were from the 1800s, little moss-covered stones barely standing anymore. A lot of them were for kids. Disease had swept through back then, taking whole families. My parents told me that some people still came by to visit, descendants, historians, tourists who'd read about the cemetery online. Most were harmless. Some were a little weird. But that day, the people who showed up were something else entirely. It was late summer, the kind of humid afternoon where the air sticks to your skin. My sister and I were outside, playing in the yard. She was a couple of years younger than me, still at that age where she followed me everywhere. I remember she had her hair in little braids that day, tied with those cheap plastic bands that always got tangled. We'd been digging around for worms, tossing them into the driveway, and watching them squirm back into the dirt. I don't know exactly when I noticed the couple. Maybe it was because the road in front of our house was usually empty, or maybe it was because something about them just felt off. But when I looked up, they were there. An old man and an old woman, walking side by side. At first, I didn't think much of it. Like I said, people came by sometimes to look at the graves. They were dressed like any other retirees, plain clothes, comfortable shoes. The woman had her gray hair pulled back into a bun, and the man had those thick glasses that made his eyes look huge. I remember thinking he looked like an owl. They slowed down as they passed our yard. Not unusual, but then they stopped. I could feel them watching us. I looked at my sister, wondering if she noticed too. She was still crouched by the dirt, completely oblivious. Then, they stepped off the road and onto our property. I don't know how to explain it, but something about the way they moved made my stomach knot up. It wasn't normal. They weren't wandering in like the other visitors, casually looking around. They were coming straight for us. My sister must have felt it too, because she stood up, brushing dirt off her hands. We weren't close enough to the house to run inside without making it obvious. I thought about just turning around and ignoring them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't going to stop. And they didn't. They kept walking. Closer. I couldn't tell you exactly how close they got, but it was close enough to see the wrinkles on their faces, the way the old woman's lips barely moved when she spoke. That's when I realized she was talking. Or maybe she had been talking the whole time, and I just hadn't heard it over the blood pounding in my ears. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the sound of her voice. Slow, soft, and then I heard it. She was asking my sister's name. She kept saying it, over and over, like a chant, like she was trying to make her say it out loud. Something in me snapped. I grabbed my sister's arm, pulling her so hard that she almost tripped. Come on. She didn't argue. We ran. I could feel them watching us the whole way, but I didn't dare look back. By the time we burst through the front door, my heart was slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. I barely got the words out as I told my mom what happened. She frowned, looking out the window, but by then, the couple was already gone. Just some weird old people, she said. She wasn't scared, but I was. For days, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them again. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. But eventually, things went back to normal. The fear started to fade. And then about a week later, I heard the news. I wasn't even paying attention at first. My parents had the TV on while they were making dinner, just another background noise in the house. But then I heard a name, the name of our town. I turned to look. It was about a missing girl, a teenager. She had been taken while walking home from school. The suspects, an elderly couple. The blood drained from my face. I knew before I even saw the pictures. But when they showed them on the screen, my stomach dropped. It was them, the same couple, the same people who had been in our yard, asking for my sister's name. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them standing there. I thought about what would have happened if we hadn't run, if my sister had answered them, if they had reached out and grabbed her. The girl they took, she was found, but not alive. For a long time, I didn't tell my sister what I saw on the news. I didn't want her to be scared the way I was. But years later, when we were older, I finally told her. She went pale. She didn't remember everything from that day, but she remembered the way I yanked her arm, the way I made her run. And for the first time, she realized that I hadn't just been playing around. We were lucky. So damn lucky. To this day, I don't know what they would have done if we had stayed, if my sister had answered them. But I know one thing for sure. They weren't just some weird old people. They were something much worse. I was 11 years old when I did something that would stick with me for the rest of my life. The day itself started like any other. It was a warm afternoon, the kind of day where you could feel the sun on your back without it burning. I was on my bike, the one that had been passed down to me from my older brother. Still a good ride, though a bit too big for me. I'd been pedaling around the neighborhood, lost in my own thoughts, not really paying attention to where I was going, just enjoying the freedom of a Saturday with no responsibilities. The street I was on wasn't busy, not by a long shot. It was a small road, lined with trees on both sides and quiet houses. At that moment, I was probably about a block away from the convenience store where I'd go to grab snacks on weekends. As I cruised along, my mind wandered to whatever game I'd play later or the homework I should have been doing. It wasn't until I heard the sudden screech of tires that I snapped out of my daze. I wasn't even sure what happened at first. It felt like I was in a dream. Everything slowed down, and for a split second, I thought I was seeing things. I was already halfway across the road when the car came into view, barreling toward me from behind the trees. I didn't even notice it until it was too late. The car's horn blared. A long, deafening honk. The kind that rattles your insides and makes your heart skip a beat. My immediate reaction wasn't to stop. No, I didn't have the sense to hit the brakes or steer away. Instead, I instinctively flipped the car off. Just instinct. Stupid, I know. I was young, I wasn't thinking clearly, and that was probably one of the dumbest things I could have done. But I did it. The car screeched to a stop, way too close. I could feel the weight of it, like it had just barely missed hitting me. The tires left a rubber mark on the road, and for a second, I thought I was going to get hit anyway. But no, the car stopped. I stood there frozen, watching as the engine idled, a loud, throaty hum that felt like it was drilling into my skull. The driver's side door creaked open, and out stepped a guy who, to put it mildly, looked like he could rip me in half with one hand. He was huge, towering over me. His arms were thick, like tree trunks, and his shirt, a faded black tank top, stretched tight across his broad chest. His face was covered in stubble, and his eyes were narrowed like he wasn't sure whether to be angry or amused. Then, something even stranger happened. A woman, his girlfriend, I assumed, got out of the passenger side. She was crying. I could hear her, even from where I stood, her voice cracking as she screamed, begging him not to open the trunk. Her hands were trembling, and her body shook as she clutched at her stomach like she was about to fall over. "Don't do it," she yelled, her voice muffled by the wind. "Please, not the trunk. Please don't open it." I stood there, not knowing what to do. My body was frozen, my mind racing in every direction but nowhere at all. The fear hit me hard, harder than I could ever have prepared for. This guy was clearly upset, and the last thing I wanted was to get involved in whatever situation was going on. I didn't know what was in that trunk, and honestly, I didn't want to know. The guy didn't seem to listen to her. He reached back, his huge hand gripping the trunk latch, pulling it open with a low, creaky noise. For a second, I thought I was going to pass out from fear. My legs were weak, and my heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. My mind raced, thinking of a million terrible possibilities. Was he going to pull out something crazy? Was there a weapon in there? A body? I couldn't even breathe right as I stood there, my eyes locked on the open trunk, expecting the worst. But then, just as quickly as he had grabbed the latch, he slammed it shut with a force that rattled the car. It was as if something snapped inside him, and all at once, the rage seemed to dissipate. The woman, who had been sobbing uncontrollably just moments before, seemed to quiet down too, but her face was still pale, eyes wide with fear. Without a word, the man got back into the car. The engine roared back to life, louder than before. The tires screeched as he hit the gas, and the car shot off down the road, disappearing around the corner. I was left standing there, my hands shaking, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what was in that trunk. I still don't, but I didn't want to know. It could have been something as simple as a broken toolbox or something far worse. A part of me hoped it was nothing more than junk, something so mundane that the whole scene had been overblown. But the way the guy acted, the way his girlfriend begged him not to open it, it didn't sit right with me. I stayed there for a while, just standing in the middle of the street, my bike still leaning against my leg. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe to see if the car came back, maybe to make sure nothing else would happen. But nothing did. The street was quiet again, the only sound the distant chirping of birds and the hum of a passing car somewhere far off. Finally, I snapped out of it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and I got back on my bike. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the handlebars, but I started pedaling again, slowly this time, keeping my head on a swivel. I don't know how long it took me to get home. but it felt like forever. That night, I kept thinking about what I'd seen. What had been in that trunk? Why had the woman been so scared? And why had the guy stopped? I couldn't stop asking myself those questions. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how close I had come to something bad. I hadn't just made a stupid mistake by flipping the guy off. I had triggered something. I didn't know what that something was, but it was clear that I had narrowly avoided being part of something darker than I could understand. I'll never know what was in that trunk, and maybe that's for the best. But I learned something that day, something that stuck with me as I grew older. Sometimes the world can turn upside down in a split second. One wrong move, and you can end up somewhere you never expected, surrounded by people you never wanted to meet. I never saw that car again. I never saw the guy or the woman. But I still think about that moment sometimes, especially when I see cars pass by on quiet roads. I can't shake the feeling that I came way too close to something I wasn't meant to know about. I never liked the basement. It wasn't some old, haunted-looking thing with cobwebs and rotting wood, nothing like that. It was just a regular basement, unfinished concrete floors, exposed beams on the ceiling, shelves lined with old storage bins, and a sectioned-off laundry room where I spent way too much time washing clothes. It wasn't the kind of place that made you feel watched or sent shivers down your spine, but I never liked it. Something about the way sound moved down there always bothered me. Maybe it was the way noises carried through the exposed pipes, or how footsteps from the floor above seemed oddly muffled. There was also the way the air always felt colder in the main part of the basement than in the laundry room, like it just sat there undisturbed. It wasn't creepy in the way people usually mean, but it always made me a little uneasy. The basement was split into two sections. One side was the laundry room, with its humming machines and brighter lighting. The other side was storage, a wide, open space filled with random junk, shelves of old paint cans, and furniture that nobody wanted but never threw away. The only light in that area was a single, dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, and that was the bulb that blew out. It happened in the middle of doing laundry. I had just transferred a load from the washer to the dryer when I heard the unmistakable pop of the bulb burning out. It wasn't some dramatic burst of sparks, just that small, sharp sound, followed by instant darkness in the other half of the basement. The laundry room still had its own light, so I wasn't left completely in the dark. But now, the rest of the basement, the part one had to walk through to get upstairs, was pitch black. I stood there for a second, staring at the doorway that led to the other side. My brain started doing that thing where it tries to convince you there's something standing in the dark, just outside of your vision. I shook off the feeling and forced myself to focus on folding some clothes while the dryer ran. I wasn't about to make a big deal out of it. It was just a blown bulb. I could change it later. But the entire time I was folding, I kept thinking about the walk back upstairs. The laundry room had no windows, and the only way out was through that other part of the basement, the part that was now completely dark. And no matter how much I told myself it was just a blown bulb, I felt uneasy about stepping into that pitch black space. I finished folding, stacked up the clothes, and took a deep breath. It was just a few steps through the dark, then up the stairs. Nothing was going to happen. I turned off the laundry room light. Immediately, darkness swallowed the entire basement. For a few seconds, I stood frozen, letting my eyes adjust. It was useless. There was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of me. I reached out, trailing my fingers along the laundry room doorframe as I stepped forward. The basement had never felt this big before. Every step felt slower than it should have, like I was wading through something invisible. The sound of my own breathing filled the space, loud in the silence. Halfway across the basement, I realized I was holding my breath. That's when I heard it. A sound, sharp and sudden, cut through the silence. Not a whisper, not a creak, a cackle. It was the kind of laugh people make when they're pretending to be a witch, sharp, scratchy, exaggerated. But this wasn't playful. This was deeper, hoarser. It sounded like whoever was making it had been smoking for 50 years, their voice ruined by time. And it came from right behind me. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second, I was frozen in place. The next, I was sprinting for the stairs. I ran so fast that I barely touched the steps. I stumbled at the top, slamming into the door with my shoulder before scrambling for the knob. I flung it open and practically threw myself into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. For a long moment, I just stood there, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I expected to hear something on the other side of the door, footsteps, breathing, anything. But there was nothing, just silence. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't that I didn't want to. It was that I couldn't think of a way to say it without sounding insane. "Hey, Dad, I heard a witch laugh in the basement. Can you go check it out?" That wasn't happening. I waited until my father got home, then casually mentioned that the basement light had burned out. He grumbled, grabbed a fresh bulb, and went downstairs. I didn't offer to help. I just stood at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing happened. No weird noises. No cackling. When he came back up, he just gave me a look and said, "Done." That was it. I never heard that sound again. I never told anyone in the house about it. But I still think about it. Because the thing that bothers me the most isn't the sound itself. It isn't even the fact that I know I heard it, loud and clear, right behind me. It's that for it to have been that close. I should have felt someone's breath on the back of my neck. That night started off like any other. It was one of those evenings where everything felt calm, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. I'd just gotten off work, a long shift as usual, and was ready to relax in the comfort of my own room. It was on the second floor of our house, and I loved the quiet up there, away from the hustle and bustle of everyone else. Downstairs, my little brother was doing his thing, watching TV or whatever he was into that night, and the dog, our loyal German Shepherd, was lying in the hallway just outside my door, probably taking a nap after a long day of chasing squirrels or whatever else dogs do to keep themselves entertained. I remember sitting back on my bed, exhausted, just scrolling through my phone. It was one of those quiet moments when the world feels like it's on pause. No noise, no stress, just peace. Then, without warning, it happened. The silence was shattered by the sound of the dog suddenly going absolutely crazy. Her nails were clicking against the hardwood floor as she raced up and down the hallway, barking and howling. It was loud enough that I could hear it clearly from upstairs, through my closed door. I could even feel the vibrations from her movements. I thought maybe something had spooked her, a person, a shadow, anything. She was never really one for being scared of random things, but who knows what she could have seen. I started to get up from the bed, thinking I'd go check it out. But then, something strange stopped me. I heard a voice. A man's voice. It was clear, but it wasn't loud. It almost sounded like someone was trying to comfort the dog, like they were speaking softly to her. It wasn't an aggressive or alarming tone. It was calm, almost soothing. "Ah, that's a good girl," the voice said. It didn't sound like my little brother. He was downstairs, after all, and he didn't speak like that. And it definitely didn't sound like our roommate. That voice, it was different. I stood there frozen for a second, trying to make sense of what I just heard. My brain was racing through possibilities. Could it be my dad's friend? The one who sometimes showed up unexpectedly, visiting from out of town? I thought maybe he'd come over early, but the voice still didn't feel familiar enough to be his. I stood up, and without thinking, I called out, "Oh, you're home early," expecting it to be someone I knew. Maybe it was one of those weird moments when you think you recognize something, but realize you don't. I wasn't even thinking straight, just reacting to the sound. I opened the door cautiously, still half expecting to see someone standing there, maybe laughing it off as a prank. But when I stepped into the hallway, I found myself frozen in confusion. There was nobody there. Absolutely nobody. The hallway was empty. The air felt cold, and the silence hit me in a way that felt unnatural, like the whole house had just stopped for a second. But then I saw her. The dog was standing there, her tail wagging. She wasn't acting scared at all anymore. She was looking at the empty end of the hallway, staring with a weird intensity, like she was waiting for something or someone. It was almost like she had been talking to someone invisible. I stepped forward, trying to shake the weird feeling off, thinking maybe it had been some kind of trick of my mind. But the dog didn't react to me. She just kept looking at the end of the hallway, like she was expecting someone to come around the corner. At that moment, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, heavy and hurried. My little brother. I'd forgotten about him for a second. He had heard the dog too. He came to my room, looking annoyed, and immediately started yelling at me. "What did you do to the dog? You're getting her all worked up," he snapped, clearly thinking I was responsible for all the noise. No, I didn't do anything," I said, my voice shaky. "Did you hear that voice too?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "What voice?" he asked, still holding his BB gun like he was ready to use it. I thought it was you messing around, but I heard the same thing. Thought you were outside or something. That stopped me in my tracks. He'd heard the same thing? The voice. The one that didn't sound like anyone we knew? That made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up a little. All right, we need to check the house, I said, my voice now more serious. I grabbed the butterfly knife from my drawer, just for reassurance, not that I expected to use it. My brother grabbed his BB gun. He wasn't taking any chances, even if we were just going to check the house. We started our sweep of the house. It was a small 2-story, so it didn't take long to check everything. We went through every room, opening closets, checking under the beds, even peeking into the attic and basement. Nothing. Not a sound. No sign of anyone. No intruder. Just the normal quiet of an old house at night. I remember standing in the living room, feeling this weird sense of unease. It was like something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We went through the kitchen, checking behind the counters, and even the back door. It was locked, just like it always was. The windows were closed, the same as when I'd left for work. Everything looked fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't. Nothing, my brother said, his voice tinged with frustration. You're sure you didn't just hear things? I looked at him, eyes wide, not sure how to respond. I heard something, man. Something wrong. And you heard it too. The house was still. No one was there. But the strange thing about it was that neither of us could explain it. Not the voice, not the dog's reaction, not the way everything felt so off in that moment. We had no explanation, and it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. After we finished searching the house, we sat down for a minute, trying to process everything. My mind kept replaying the moment I opened that door and saw nothing. The dog had been so calm, but it had been staring at something that wasn't there. And the voice, who said it? Where did it come from? I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, we just went back to our rooms. My brother grumbled about the dog, but didn't say much else. The dog stayed in the hallway for a while, but she didn't seem bothered anymore. She just lay down, calm as could be, like nothing had ever happened. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing things, little creaks and groans of the house settling, but every sound made me jump. My thoughts kept drifting back to that voice. That calm, male voice that I couldn't place. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. My little brother was downstairs, playing his video games, and the dog was curled up on the couch, looking as peaceful as ever. But the strange feeling stayed with me. We never figured out what had happened that night. There was no one in the house, no signs of forced entry, and nothing unusual in the neighborhood. Everything just went back to normal, like it was all in our heads. But even now, I can't help but think about it. The voice, the dog, the way everything felt wrong for just a moment, like something was off that we couldn't see. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe we were both just jumpy. But I'll never forget that feeling. And to this day, whenever I'm alone in that house, especially at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching just out of sight. Maybe I'll never know what happened, but whatever it was, it still gives me the creeps. "5 years ago, things started to feel a little off when my mom began dating a guy she met on a dating site. Honestly, I didn't think much of it at first. After all, I had met the woman who would later become my wife through a similar way, so I didn't want to judge. But something about him just didn't sit right with me. He wasn't rude or outwardly mean, but he had this way of making me and my wife uncomfortable without saying or doing anything overtly wrong. He was quiet, often too quiet, like he was always thinking about something else. He had this strange habit of keeping his eyes closed, and sometimes, when he'd talk to us, it felt like he wasn't really looking at us, but rather staring into the distance. It wasn't always, just every once in a while, but when it happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right with him. Then there were the little things. Like one time, my wife and I were over at my mom's house. She had to go into work, so we were hanging out, killing time. Her boyfriend was there too, but he didn't talk much. He spent the entire time in her bedroom with the door closed. I remember it bothering me, but I didn't say anything. I just kept my thoughts to myself. It's funny because at the time, I didn't know why I felt so uneasy around him. He wasn't threatening, but there was a certain coldness about him that rubbed me the wrong way. My wife felt the same, but we both figured it was just us being overly cautious. People are often uncomfortable with new people in their lives, and maybe that's all it was. But looking back now, I realized we had instincts for a reason. Then things started to get complicated. Around the time of Christmas, my mom's relationship with him began to unravel. My wife and I had visited her for the holidays, and we could tell something was off. She sat us down and shared everything, her doubts, her frustrations, how things weren't working out. She wasn't entirely sure how to handle it. My wife and I listened carefully, offering our support, and we told her that maybe it was best to end things. She seemed to agree, but she was also in that weird stage where she'd already made up her mind to break up with him. And she did, on Christmas Eve. I remember that night clearly. We all went to bed, but things didn't feel right. There was this heavy silence in the house, like something important had just happened, and now everything was waiting. But we tried to keep the mood light. After all, it was Christmas. The next morning, we woke up early to visit my dad. We had planned to spend the day with him and my stepmom, but a snowstorm rolled in unexpectedly. We were trapped at my dad's house for the night. It was actually a nice surprise, in a way. The snow had a peaceful, almost magical quality to it. Christmas Day was spent cooped up inside, the world outside blanketed in white, and it was just us, warm and content. My wife and I were happy to be with my dad, but the thought of my mom stuck at home, dealing with the aftermath of her breakup, weighed on my mind. The next day, the snow cleared up a little, and we knew we had to go check on her. My wife had this awful gut feeling, though, like something was wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with my mom's now ex. I wasn't sure what she was thinking, but I trusted her instinct. So, on the way home, we made a detour to my mom's place. When we pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed something felt off. My mom's car was there, but she didn't always drive. She lived close enough to work that she often walked. So, seeing her car in the driveway didn't necessarily mean anything. But the unease was building in the pit of my stomach. I'll never forget the way my wife looked at me when we got out of the car. Her face was pale, and she had this tight look in her eyes like she already knew something was wrong. She always has a good sense of things like that, so I followed her lead. My mom had never locked her door, which always drove me crazy. I think it was part of her old-school charm, but it also made me feel exposed. We let ourselves in, quietly closing the door behind us. It was eerily quiet inside. I called out for my mom, but there was no response. The house seemed darker than usual, and it was strange. We moved through the hallway cautiously, passing the kitchen, when I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There was blood. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I looked closer, I saw it oozing out from the refrigerator's water dispenser. It had filled the little spill tray under the fridge and was spreading across the floor, forming a red puddle that seemed to pool in every direction. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold rush of fear wash over me. The sight was so out of place, so wrong. My wife screamed, and I froze. I had to remind myself to breathe, but it felt like every breath came out shallow. I was expecting the worst. My mind immediately went to my mom. I had a horrible thought that maybe something had happened to her. She could be hurt, unconscious, or worse. The blood, it felt too real. It felt like something bad had already happened. I didn't want to touch the puddle. It felt like if I did, I'd be confirming the worst. But my wife was already ahead of me. She was already moving toward the kitchen, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle of the freezer. The whole house seemed to close in around us. I took a deep breath and, against every instinct, opened the freezer. The smell that hit me wasn't blood. It was something cold, something sweet, almost metallic. My brain couldn't make sense of it at first. And then I saw it. A bag of frozen cherries torn open, its contents spilling out onto the ice dispenser. The cherries had been crammed into the freezer so forcefully that the bag had fallen over, and as it thawed, the juices had leaked out, pooling onto the spill tray and mingling with the other liquid. I was relieved, but the tension didn't leave my body. The blood-like liquid was just cherries, but why did it look like that? The whole thing felt like a twisted accident, an unfortunate turn of events that had somehow led to an incredibly bizarre and unsettling scene. We checked the rest of the house. My mom wasn't there. The whole place was silent, almost too silent. We waited for her to come back, and when she finally did, she seemed utterly unfazed, which only made things stranger. It wasn't until later that we pieced together the full picture. My mom had broken up with the guy on Christmas Eve, and she had told him she needed some space. But when she returned home, she found him in her bedroom, sitting on her bed in the dark, as if he had never left. He wasn't angry or violent, but his presence was suffocating. He didn't understand boundaries. He didn't respect the break. That's when the odd things started to make sense. The odd behavior, the way he kept to himself, the weird comments. But that wasn't the worst part. It wasn't until much later, when we spoke to her neighbors, that we found out just how far he'd gone. He'd been lurking around the neighborhood, showing up at odd hours, walking past her house. Always silent, always watching. The way he kept his eyes shut, it was almost as if he was hiding something. Like he knew he wasn't supposed to be there, but couldn't stop himself. The guy wasn't dangerous, but he was unsettling. After everything calmed down, we never saw him again. My mom eventually locked her doors. We all moved on with our lives. But I'll never forget that day. The blood on the floor, the frozen cherries, and the fear that gripped me as I tried to figure out what had happened, what it all meant. It was the weirdest feeling I've ever had. Not a real threat, but a lingering unease that I couldn't shake off. Now, I think back and wonder how close we came to something worse. If we hadn't stopped by that day, if my wife hadn't insisted on checking on my mom, how long would it have taken before things got really bad? It was a chilly evening in the late 80s, winter in Texas, and while the days could scorch with heat, the nights were brutally cold, especially in the desert. The wind had picked up as usual, whipping around the little house my sister and I shared with our parents in a small, sleepy town. We didn't mind it much, though. We were used to the gusts that could send empty cans rolling across the streets, and the air always smelled dry, almost like dust. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where you could walk to the corner store and bump into 3 people you knew without even trying. On this particular evening, my parents were out for the night, likely visiting friends or taking care of errands. My older sister, 15 at the time, was in charge of me. This wasn't unusual. She was the one who babysat me most nights. We had a good relationship despite the age gap. I always thought she was cool, and even though she often had better things to do, she was good about keeping me entertained. We were sitting in the common room, which, for all its comfort, could get a little spooky at night. The room was dim, lit only by the glow from the TV. The furniture was old, but cozy enough. The TV, one of those bulky models with the big dials, was playing something typical for that time. A news program, the kind that made you feel like the world was always on the brink of disaster. I was too young to fully grasp the severity of the stories, but I got the gist of things: crime, tragedy, and the dark undercurrents that could lurk in your own neighborhood. That night, we were watching one of those investigative crime shows. The ones where the news anchor speaks in a gravely serious tone, telling you about a horrific crime that happened just down the street. The story was about a man who had gone completely off the rails. Apparently, the quiet neighbor who nobody suspected turned out to be a monster, going on a rampage and kidnapping a young girl from his next-door neighbor's house. The details were grim, and even though my sister and I had seen our fair share of these stories, this one felt different. It felt too real, too close to home. The wind had started to howl outside, rattling the windows, and the darkness outside pressed in against the walls of the room. I remember how the blackness seemed to wrap around us, suffocating and endless, like there was something watching from just beyond the glass. The back door to our house had these huge floor-to-ceiling windows on one wall, and right next to it was a large glass door leading to the backyard. It wasn't like we had a huge yard or anything. It was just empty space stretching into the dark desert. But that door, those windows, always made me feel like I wasn't alone. If you weren't careful, the back door could give you the creeps when the wind kicked up, especially if you didn't have the back light on, which tonight we didn't. My sister was sitting on the floor, leaning forward with her legs crossed, absorbed in the crime story. I was sitting beside her, a few feet away, hugging my knees as I tried to make sense of the things they were talking about. We didn't say much, though. The show didn't make for casual conversation. About 45 minutes into the program, things started getting more intense. The story was about the manhunt for the guy who'd abducted the little girl, and I remember the news anchor's voice growing more urgent with each passing moment. I was still focused on the screen, not really paying attention to anything else. Then came the bang. The front door, a solid wooden one, with a glass storm door on the outside, was suddenly hit with a series of violent, earth-shaking knocks. Bam, bam, bam. The kind of noise that feels like it could make the whole house collapse in on itself. My heart lurched in my chest, and I froze. My sister jumped up so quickly that she nearly knocked over the TV remote. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I was too scared to make a sound. "Yeah," she replied, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide. "Stay here. I'll check." But neither of us moved for a moment. The house, which just seconds ago had felt familiar and safe, now seemed impossibly large and eerily silent, as if the world outside had shifted and we were no longer part of it. A minute passed, then another. We waited in complete silence. The only sounds came from the wind, whipping at the windows like a living thing. My sister, her face pale, was kneeling near the door to the hallway, staring at the front door. I could see her mouth move, but she didn't say anything. She was just staring, waiting. "Maybe it's just something from outside," I said, trying to convince myself. "Could be," she replied, her voice shaky. But even as she said it, we heard something else. The distinct sound of the storm door outside the front door slowly closing. Someone had opened the door. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My chest tightened with the realization that this wasn't just some wind or freak accident. Someone had been out there. Someone had tried to get in. My sister crawled over to the TV, her movements fast and jerky, and she turned the dial, clicking it off. The sound of the dial turning echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. The room, now fully dark except for the glow of the kitchen light down the hall, felt suffocating. The TV screen went black. All we had left was the dim light from the kitchen and the oppressive silence surrounding us. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the front door. Every noise, every creak of the house, made me jump. Then it happened. I saw it. The knob on the back door, the one that led to the yard, began to turn. The rattling of the handle was soft at first, like someone was gently testing it. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. My sister must have heard it too, because I saw her body tense, her eyes glued to the door as if she too was frozen in place. I had no idea what to do. We were trapped in this small room, with nothing but the glass door and the front door between us and whoever was outside. The knob rattled again, louder this time. Someone was trying to open it. The sound of the handle moving was followed by the unmistakable bam 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 of someone forcing the door open. The whole wall of windows shook violently with every jerk of the door. My reflection in the glass flickered and blurred as the door rattled against the frame. With each forceful bang, the whole house seemed to tremble, and I thought, no, I knew, that someone was about to break through the door. And then it stopped. Dead silence. My sister, now visibly trembling, screamed at the top of her lungs. "Go! We have to get out of here." She grabbed me by the arm and dragged me toward her bedroom. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled after her. She slammed the door shut behind us and started piling her mattress and whatever she could find in front of it. The phone. We needed the phone. Her panic was overwhelming as she scrambled for the beige plastic phone. It was heavy, and the long metal antenna seemed out of place in the dim room. My sister dialed, but in her state of panic, she couldn't remember the number for the sheriff's office. The seconds felt like hours as she desperately hit the redial button, praying for help. The phone rang twice, and then someone on the other end picked up. "Help! Help!" she gasped, her voice broken. "Someone's trying to get in." She didn't even know who she was speaking to, just that someone needed to get to us. I curled up on the floor, unable to move or speak, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had never felt so terrified in my entire life. We didn't hear anything else after that. The minutes stretched on as we waited in total silence. Then we saw the headlights. My sister's friend had arrived with her parents, and we could finally breathe again. The night never felt like it ended. The next morning, we went through the motions, acting like nothing had happened, but the scuff marks on the bottom of the back door lingered in my mind. We never figured out who had been there or why they were trying to get in. There were no signs of forced entry, no marks on the door, and nothing was missing. It was as if the entire ordeal had been some twisted nightmare. But it was real. After that, my sister and I made sure every door was locked, every window secured. We didn't take anything for granted, because sometimes there are no clear answers, just memories that stay with you long after the terror fades. And we never, ever forgot to lock the doors. My grandmother's house is unlike any place I've ever been. It's old, really old. The kind of place that creaks and moans in the night, its wooden beams whispering their age in the dark. The house was built in the late 1700s, and you can tell. The floorboards have deep grooves where people have walked for centuries, and the walls have an almost oppressive weight to them. But it's also beautiful, in a strange way, with its tall windows and heavy, hand-carved furniture. It sits at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by graveyards. There are 2 of them, one on each side of the house. Most people would find that unsettling, but to me, it's just normal. My grandmother has lived there her whole life, and I've spent countless summers playing in the garden or wandering between the gravestones, trying to catch frogs or picking flowers. It's just what you do when you grow up in a place like that. I hadn't seen my old friend Caleb in months. He'd been away at a drug treatment program, and while he was there, he'd told me he had some kind of spiritual awakening. He wasn't religious in the traditional sense, but he'd said he felt more tuned into things, like he could sense things more clearly now. He didn't explain it fully, and I didn't press him. It wasn't really my business. Still, I believed him. Caleb had always been a bit of a deep thinker, and if anything could have helped him after everything he'd been through, I figured it was this new perspective. So when he showed up at my door one morning, I was more than happy to see him. We decided to take a walk down the long, cobblestone driveway that led to my grandmother's house. The sun was shining, and the air was crisp, one of those perfect early autumn days. The leaves had just started to turn, and the driveway was a carpet of reds and golds, the stones beneath our feet making a satisfying crunch with every step. As we walked, Caleb started talking about his newfound spirituality. He said he felt like he was more aware of everything around him, like the world had more meaning than he'd ever realized before. He spoke with such intensity, his voice carrying a seriousness that I hadn't heard in him before. I nodded along, not exactly understanding what he meant, but feeling the weight of his words. I didn't have to understand to know that something had changed in him. It wasn't until my cat, Luna, came over to us that I started to feel like something was off. She was a sleek black cat with bright yellow eyes that always seemed to be watching you, following your every move. I had raised her since she was a kitten, and she always had this eerie way of showing up at the most random times. Luna walked up to me, rubbing against my leg in that way she does when she wants attention. But this time, she wouldn't stop. She kept nudging me, pressing her little body against my leg, as if something were bothering her. It wasn't like her to be this persistent. I bent down to pet her, and she looked up at me, her eyes wide, pupils dilated. She meowed once, and I swear it sounded different, more urgent, like she was trying to tell me something. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just in a mood. But after a few minutes, I noticed she wasn't leaving. She wasn't going to stop rubbing against my leg until I followed her. So I did. I turned and started walking down the driveway, my eyes on Luna as she trotted ahead, glancing back to make sure I was following. Caleb, still caught up in his talk about his spiritual awakening, trailed behind me, occasionally glancing at Luna but not saying anything. Luna led me off the path, heading straight for the graveyard on the left side of the house. Now, I've walked through that graveyard hundreds of times, but there was something different about this walk. Something about the way Luna was moving, so deliberately, so insistent. When we reached the edge of the graveyard, Luna stopped and looked at me. I felt a strange chill run through me, but I couldn't explain it. She turned, her yellow eyes fixed on a particular gravestone, and walked straight toward it. I followed, my feet feeling heavier with each step. When we reached the grave, Luna jumped up onto the headstone, balancing on the thin, slanted part at the top. She didn't move from there, just sat perfectly still, her body rigid. Her tail flicked in the air, and she began to hiss. It wasn't the kind of hiss you hear when a cat is annoyed. It was something deeper, almost threatening. "Luna, come on," I called softly, stepping toward her. But she didn't budge. I reached out to pull her off the stone, but as soon as I touched her, she hissed louder, her back arched, her claws bared. I jumped back, startled. Caleb was now standing next to me, his expression serious. "What's going on with her?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I said, swallowing hard. "She's never acted like this before." We stood there for a moment, watching her. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, heavy and fast. There was something wrong with the whole situation. It wasn't just Luna's behavior, it was everything. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced at the gravestone where Luna had decided to plant herself. The name on it was faint, the engraving worn down by time, but it looked familiar. I couldn't place it right away, but there was something about it that tugged at my memory. I leaned closer, reading the inscription carefully. The name was Hannah Lawson, and the date of death was from over 100 years ago. And then it hit me. I looked back at the house, where I knew my grandmother's family had lived for generations. My great-great-grandmother, I remembered, had told me stories about the original owners of the house, the Lawsons. Hannah Lawson had lived and died in that house long before my grandmother ever moved in. She had been a child, just like me. But it wasn't just the name that struck me, it was the feeling of familiarity. The kind of feeling you get when you're sure you've met someone before, but you can't remember where or when. "Is that?" Caleb started, his voice trailing off as he caught sight of the gravestone. His eyes widened. "Do you think she lived in your house?" "I think so," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This was her grave. There was a long silence. Caleb stared at the gravestone, and I could feel Luna's gaze on me, even though she wasn't moving. Her yellow eyes never left mine. "Maybe we should go inside," I suggested. But it was like my feet were frozen to the ground. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Luna. It was as if she was waiting for something, like she was trying to communicate something important. But what? I don't know how long we stood there, staring at the gravestone and Luna, but eventually, she jumped down from the stone, as if she had decided it was enough. She trotted back to me and rubbed against my leg, purring now. It was as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had. We walked back to the house in silence. When we got inside, I felt exhausted, mentally, physically, like I had just run a marathon. I sat down in the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Caleb was quiet too. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant. It wasn't until later that night, after dinner, that Caleb showed me the photo he had taken of Luna on the gravestone. The photo was clear, the gravestone standing tall in the background, with Luna perched on top, her eyes glowing in the dim light. But something else was in the photo, something I hadn't noticed before. At the very edge of the frame, just barely visible, was a figure. A shadow. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness, but it was there, standing just behind the gravestone, watching. We didn't speak of it again, but I couldn't get that feeling out of my head. The feeling that we were never truly alone in that house, or in the graveyard. I haven't told anyone else about that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. But every time I walk past the gravestone now, I can't help but wonder. Was Luna trying to tell me something? Or was it all just coincidence? I guess I'll never really know. But sometimes, when the wind picks up and the house creaks late at night, I swear I can hear whispers coming from the graveyard. When I was between 8 and 11, my sister used to babysit me when my parents went out. There wasn't much to do in our quiet little town, so it was usually just the two of us in the house. She was 7 years older than me, and even though she sometimes acted annoyed by my presence, I didn't mind. She'd take care of me while smoking her cigarettes on the front porch, and I'd tag along, running around, trying to get her attention. I remember the way the air always felt so thick when she'd light up, like the world slowed down. I'd follow her outside into the carport where the driveway met the street. The house we lived in wasn't big, but it had a huge front yard. Our carport was right in front of the house, and from there, you could see the street. It wasn't a busy road, and the neighborhood was always quiet. The sounds of crickets and the occasional car passing by made the night feel safe, like nothing could go wrong. But then, one evening, something changed. I was playing near the carport while my sister was smoking, like usual. The routine had always been the same. She'd sit on the porch, and I'd run around or annoy her, trying to get her to pay attention to me. That evening, however, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't loud or intrusive, it was just there. A white SUV. It was parked at the very end of our driveway, facing our house. It sat there, just idling. It wasn't moving, and it didn't seem like anyone was getting out. What struck me the most were the tinted windows. I'd never seen windows so dark. You couldn't see a single thing inside. It wasn't just the windows being a little darker. It was like they'd been blackened completely. I tried to look through the windows from the side, but there was nothing, just a black void. I didn't say anything at first, because I was too busy wondering why it was there. The SUV just sat there, blocking the end of the driveway, like it was waiting for something. My sister noticed it too, but she didn't act alarmed. She was used to a quiet life, and wasn't easily scared by things like this. When she went inside, I kept watching from the carport. I was curious about it, but I didn't want to get too close. Eventually, the SUV slowly turned around and drove down the road to the church parking lot. It didn't disappear into the night. It just parked there, and it stayed there for a while. I couldn't see it clearly from the carport, but I knew it was still there. This became a pattern. It didn't happen every day, but whenever my sister went out to smoke, the SUV would show up again. It would park at the end of our driveway, just sitting there. Sometimes, it would be at the church parking lot after that. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much more about it at the time. After a few days of this, my sister finally mentioned it to me. "There's something wrong with that car," she said, but she wasn't frightened. She was just annoyed. I didn't fully understand at the time, but I could tell something was off about it. It wasn't normal for someone to just park at the end of a driveway and sit there for so long. But my sister was brave. She shrugged it off and didn't think it was worth mentioning to anyone, even though I had a feeling that maybe it was. But then, it happened again the next day. The SUV showed up, and this time, it stayed longer. It parked at the end of the driveway, right where it had been before, and I watched it. My sister was outside again, doing her usual thing, not paying much attention, but I was still too young to just ignore it. This time, I didn't stay in the carport. I went inside to look out of the front window, peeking through the curtains. From there, I could see the white SUV clearly. It wasn't moving at all. I didn't know what to think, but it felt strange. The car seemed to be just waiting. I couldn't see who was in it, but I had this nagging feeling that the driver was watching my sister. It was unsettling. I don't know how long it sat there, but eventually it pulled away. The SUV turned down the street and went toward the church parking lot again, just like before. But this time, my sister didn't let it slide. She went inside and told our father, who happened to be a sheriff's deputy at the time, about the SUV. He made a call to the police, told them about the car, and made a complaint. The cops showed up, but by the time they got there, the SUV was gone. They looked around the area, but they couldn't find anything. The car had vanished into thin air. It was strange, but it wasn't until a few months later that the car showed up again. And this time, it was even worse. Months passed since the white SUV had first appeared, and things settled back into normality. My sister stopped mentioning it. My parents were busy, life moved on, and the SUV disappeared as mysteriously as it had come. I had nearly forgotten about it, until one day it reappeared. I was outside with my sister again, like we always were when our parents were out. I don't remember the exact day or why, but I remember everything felt unusually quiet. The weather was calm, the kind of serene, lazy afternoon that made the whole neighborhood feel like a sleepy town you see in movies. My sister was standing in the carport again, cigarette in hand, her eyes scanning the empty road like she had a sixth sense that something wasn't quite right. It was then that I saw it. The white SUV was back. I wasn't sure if it was the same one from before, but it looked exactly like it. I could see the tinted windows from the distance, the same thick blackness that hid whoever might be inside. It sat there, at the end of the driveway, idling as usual. It was just sitting, not moving, facing the house. It didn't seem to do anything for a long time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. My sister noticed it too, but she didn't act scared. She wasn't the type to get easily spooked. She looked at it, raised an eyebrow, and then went back to doing her usual thing, puffing on her cigarette, acting like it wasn't there. But that uneasy feeling grew inside me again. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the eerie silence, the dark windows that seemed to watch us, but something felt off. As the minutes ticked by, the SUV didn't leave. It was just there. I watched from the front window. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. And that's when it hit me. The driver wasn't just sitting there. He was watching my sister. I couldn't see his face, if there even was one, just the outline of the vehicle and the darkness behind the windows. It was too quiet. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I was just imagining things. But then my sister went inside, and the SUV stayed. It didn't follow her. It didn't go anywhere. It just stayed. That night, she mentioned it to our father. He didn't seem concerned at first, chalking it up to some curious stranger or someone just lost. But then he made the call. He reached out to the local police again, explained what had been happening, and asked for them to check it out. They came, but when they arrived, the SUV was already gone. They searched the area, but it was like it had vanished once again. Weeks went by without a trace of the SUV. It almost felt like it had been a dream. That is, until it came back again. It wasn't long before my sister had had enough. I could see it in her eyes that day. She wasn't going to let it go on anymore. I don't know if it was the waiting or the feeling of being watched that pushed her to the edge, but she was fed up. That day, she told me to stay in the carport, told me not to follow her, but I didn't listen. I was curious, maybe a little scared, but I followed her anyway. I stayed hidden behind the wall of the carport, peeking around the corner. I wanted to see what she would do, if she would go down the driveway to confront the person in the SUV. She started walking slowly toward the SUV. She didn't seem scared at first, but I could tell her pace had slowed the closer she got. My heart was in my throat as I watched her move toward the driveway, every step bringing her closer to that unnerving white SUV. Halfway down the driveway, she stopped. It wasn't like she'd seen something. There was no sudden movement from the SUV, no warning signs. But something changed. She later told us that, in that moment, she had felt a wave of terror, something deep and primal, like an instinct that screamed at her to turn around before it was too late. She said it was the kind of fear you can't ignore, the kind that paralyzes you and makes your legs feel like they're made of stone. She was right to stop. She turned around and walked back toward the house. I stayed behind the carport wall, too afraid to move, but I could see her face. She was shaken. I felt like if I went any further, she later told us, I knew I wouldn't come back. It was like something in my gut told me, you're dead if you go any closer. She went inside, leaving me standing there, confused and a little scared. I didn't understand why she felt that way, but I could see it in her eyes. It was real. Something about that SUV was wrong. Then came the night when things escalated. Our family car had been in the shop, and we were stuck at home for the night. My parents were around, so there was some comfort in that, but it still felt eerie. My sister went outside to smoke again, like she did most nights. I went with her, mostly out of habit, but also because I wasn't sure I could sleep that night without knowing what was going on. We were sitting outside, talking quietly when it happened. The SUV appeared again, just like it always did. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran back inside the house, past the window, to tell my father. I couldn't explain why, but I knew something needed to be done about it. My father acted quickly. As soon as he heard me, he grabbed his gun. I saw him walk briskly down the driveway, not making any loud noises, but walking with purpose. The SUV, parked at the end of our driveway, didn't move at first. But as my father neared, the car started up, and within seconds it floored it, peeling out onto the main highway like it had been waiting for him to approach. My father was a seasoned deputy, and he didn't miss a detail. He noted the year and model of the SUV, the bike rack on top, and the way it had sped away. But the most unsettling part was the license plate. My father later told us that it had been covered with